Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the second day of a two-day capacity building workshop for the fifth United Nations Environment Assembly Train-to-Trainer webinar series. The events have been organized by Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future in collaboration with the Civil Society Unit at the United Nations Environment Program. For those of you who were not with us yesterday, I'm Charles Newhan, Chairman of Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future, and your host today from New York. I'm joined by our presenters, Felix Dodds, who is in Apex, North Carolina in the United States, and Leida Reinhout, who joins us from Brussels, Belgium. Felix and Leida are senior advisors to Stakeholder Forum. For those of you not familiar with Stakeholder Forum, we are an international not-for-profit NGO that has, for some 25 years, been working to advance sustainable development at all levels. Stakeholder Forum seeks to provide a bridge between those who have a stake in sustainable development and the international forums where decisions are made in their name. I'll begin with a bit of housekeeping. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and live streamed on the Stakeholder Forum YouTube channel. And that recording, by way of a link to the SF YouTube page and a copy of the presentation, will be posted on the Stakeholder Forum website soon. In fact, the material from the first day is there now. As you will see, all attendee cameras and microphones are muted and will remain that way throughout the webinar. There will be two sets of 3 sessions, much like yesterday, each followed by a 10-minute question and answer period and a 15-minute comfort break in between the 2 sessions. If we do not need all of the time for questions, we'll move on to the following session. Questions should be submitted in the Q&A window, not in the chat window. So please, you're also welcome to scroll through the questions and provide upvotes. That feature has been enabled. That is, if you vote for a question you too would like to be addressed, that will help us to select the questions that the speakers can answer in the time that we have. Apologies in advance if we're not able to answer all of your questions due to time constraints. I'll begin by introducing today's presenters for those of you who were not here yesterday. Felix Dodds is an adjunct professor and a senior affiliate at the Water Institute at the Environmental Science Engineering at the University of North Carolina in the United States. He is also associate fellow at the Telus Institute. Felix was the co-director of the 2014 and 2018 Nexus Conferences on Water, Food, Energy, and Climate at UNC, is a prolific author on the subject of global sustainability, and was the executive director of Stakeholder Forum from 1992 to 2012. Leida Reinhout has been program coordinator of resource justice and sustainability at Friends of the Earth Europe. In her position as executive director of ANPED and director of global policies at the European Environmental Bureau, Leida facilitated and coordinated the global NGO community to realize their active engagement in the United Nations processes on sustainable development and the environment. Please welcome Felix and Leida. Felix will be delivering the first section. And I'll hand the floor over to Felix. Felix, engage your mic and the floor is yours.
That's great. Could you just move us on to the first relevant slide? Keep going. That's great. So the first discussion we're going to have today is kind of how do you put together a resolution? And it's something that there are particular aspects of a resolution's I guess, narrative that need to be approached. So the 2 particular aspects we're going to address here at the moment are what they call preambular paragraph and operative paragraph. So when you're writing a resolution, the preambular paragraph, in a sense, deals very much with reminding people of things that have happened. So it reminds people of previous agreements on whatever's relevant. So it might be we remember the World Summit on Sustainable Development's program of action. We remember the Rio +20 future for us, or whatever we called it. So that's how you deal with that. But then when you want actual activity, it's the operative paragraph. And so when they're designing those first few iterations of a resolution, you'll find, though these won't necessarily be up on the website of the UN, but they will be shared among member states, you'll have it where they'll actually have PP1, PP2, PP3, and then they'll move down to the operative paragraphs, OP1, OP2, OP3. They start with a verb to kind of present this, the process forward. If you could move to the next slide, because I think that takes us into that's not the next slide. Okay, it clearly is the next slide. Keep going to the next slide. So one of the issues, no, go back. One of the issues that is quite important in the context of developing resolutions is understanding the translation of particular words. And so often words have different cultural meanings if you're changing it. So for example, if you're having a target for the more Anglo world, so the United States, the UK, it tends to be much more firm. It's more of a legally approached term. So that when they sign up for targets, they have more of an intention in theory to deliver it. For other cultures, it may be a less defined word. It may be for French that, at least during the Johannesburg process, the French saw targets as more aspirational. And so if you are trying to move forward particular terms in paragraphs, then you need to understand what the cultural reference of that word is. And so it's very important to have that conversation with the different governments. So if you're putting in targets, what does that mean for French speaking country? What does it mean for China? What does it mean for a Spanish speaking country? Understanding that issue on translation is important, because otherwise you are not having the same conversations. We could move to the next slide. So I've put a slightly humorous one up here, but to try and give you an idea of which words are preambular and which are operational. So affirming is a preambular one. It would start with affirming previous agreements. Cause for means it's an action, so it would be an operative word. And then if you look at the way I've designed this, I've tried to give you an idea of the strength of what's being asked. If it's just the term and no action, then it has no real teeth to it. If it's a term which says who should do it, so if it says it wants UNEP to do something, then you've clearly defined who's to do the action. Or if it's to say government should do this, you've clearly defined who's going to take that action. Does it have a timetable? So as we do with the SDGs and with the Paris Agreement, we have a timetable. So we know when these things are going to be done by. So it's a stronger. So we know who has to do it. We know who the timetable is. And does it have a monitoring mechanism? So is there a report back process by which you can see whether or not we're achieving that? So for the Sustainable Development Goals, it will be the voluntary national reports. For the climate negotiations, it will be the national adaptation plans or their national targets that they're reporting to the Glasgow meeting next year. So if you've got a paragraph, do look at that paragraph to see which of these, in a sense, what the strength of that paragraph is, because that might be something where you can have an influence in strengthening it by putting in a monitoring mechanism, or strengthening it by putting in a date, or strengthening it by being very specific on who you want to take that action. The other thing to know is that when you're developing a resolution, particularly at the very beginning of developing a resolution, then you look to find text that exists in existing agreements. Because if you can footnote where that text came from, then the governments feel comfortable that they had already agreed that, but so that agreement might have been in an FAO resolution in Rome, or it might have been at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. If you can reference that and take specific text as you build up your resolution, then it strengthens the ability for the governments to take that on. The additional text, of course, that you'll be adding, which will be new, the objective then is to look for other places where there's some support for that. So, for example, if the Global Environmental Outlook report of UNEP says something, that's important to put in. It's not a government agreement because it's a report, but it shows that, that the UN agency in question has thought that that issue is of importance. And if you can, again, use existing text, that is a really good way of building up a resolution. If we could look to the next slide, if we could. So just an example of what a PP and an OP looks like. So as I say, a preamble paragraph looks at reaffirming previous agreements. So here it's looking at the 2030 agenda. It's mentioning what's in that agenda that's specific to this particular resolution. And it's referencing the Millennium Development Goals. So it's not asking, in a sense, for you to do something new. It's reminding you of something that you've already agreed to, or the governments have already agreed to. The operational paragraph is looking to either to recognize something that's come out. And so in this case, it's a report of the Secretary General on the implementation of Agenda 21, the program for further implementation of Agenda 21, which was the 1997 agreement, the outcome of the World Summit on Sustainable Development, and the conference Rio +20, which was the UN Conference on Sustainable Development. So that report would be a update on the delivery of those agreements. Now, note is not a strong word. It doesn't have, in a sense, an action. There's no action for someone to do something on it. There's no target to do anything with it, and there's no monitoring mechanism. So it's in a sense, it's a weak paragraph for an operational paragraph. But sometimes you need to have those in to get a report that that is an important report, which will enable you then to use some of the material from that report to get action in further operational paragraphs. So it can play an important role in framing the discussion that you're then going to lead to a set of more specific actions that that you want to recommend underneath that. If you could move to the next slide, please. So we've designed what you could say is homework, but it's really up to you whether you want to do it. And the next 3 slides are an opportunity for you, if you want, after the webinar, to go and, in a sense, have a go at looking at which are these. Are they preamble paragraphs or operational paragraphs? If you want to do that and send it back to me, then I will look at it and see how you've done it. And I'm happy to feedback some comments on why I think you're wrong or why I think you're right there. But what you generally find is when you're dealing with preamble paragraphs, it's in a sense words like noting, expressing, reaffirming, calling, recognizing, reiterating, conscious of, emphasizing. So it's very much that type of terminology. And the diagram that I had earlier gives you an indication of that. Then you have, for the operational ones, you have things like reaffirms, calls for, requests, takes note with appreciation, takes note with regret, which means you haven't done anything, urges action. Those are more action orientated verbs to get the governments to do something or to get the UN agencies to do something. So if you would like, I'm happy to respond to you having a go at this. We have two slides that deal with it, where all you would do is put PP or OP next to the relevant beginning of the paragraph. And then if you move to the third one on this, what the third one was to give you something which you would then have to put into a form similar to OP or PP. So this is something which is not written in that way. And so it's not, in a sense, written to be a resolution. It's the kind of thing that a lot of NGOs might write up in the way that they're saying the terminology. But if you want to try and convert those into OP and PP paragraphs, again, I'm very happy to make comment. And as you can see at the bottom of this slide, there's my email, and we can communicate and maybe help you to appreciate how to do that. Normally we would do this in a workshop in person, and you will be sent into groups to do that, but we can't do that. Thank you for that slide. I think that's the last one on this particular aspect. So we're into the question and answer on drawing up a resolution. Charles, do you want to come back in?
Thank you, Felix. And Lida, please come in too. Just to say to our audience, I see that some people have raised their hands in the chat box, but what we ask you to do is please, we're not going to be activating microphones. If you could put your question in the Q&A box, Felix and Lida will answer your questions. So at the moment, there are no questions in the Q&A. Let's give a moment for the audience to put some questions in. Questions, please, regarding that first module. Here we go. Well, the question, can we get a transcript of these sessions? Well, we are going to be posting the entire video. Will be on YouTube. So you'll be able to go back and refer to it that way.
And the overheads, we'll have a PDF and a PowerPoint that you can download. And one of the objectives of this is, should you want to run a similar type of workshop yourself in your country for your colleagues in your organization or among organizations, the material will be made available for you to do that. And we're, of course, here if you've got any questions.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just be clear on that. We will upload the entire presentation as PDF. I will also create slides, or it might even be better to make it a Word document, Felix, for the homework section, so people can cut and paste and put things in order. And that can we'll just make it so that it can be downloaded from the Stakeholder Forum webinars page, where the same links will be to the videos and the PowerPoint.
So the question that we've had is, what is the role of UN resolutions in terms of the UN system and in terms of member states? Yeah. And it depends on the resolution and the objective of that resolution. So most of the resolutions that I've been dealing with are things like the Rio +20 document or the Agenda 2030, which have commitments in there for both member states and for governments. More recently, I got through a General Assembly resolution on sustainable investment and worked with a number of governments to get that resolution there. And the action for that was, in a sense, to try and get the private sector to do specific things. So the target was that, but with UN support, like support from UNCTAD and from the Finance for Development Office. So the resolution can deal with actions by governments, can be actions by the UN agencies and programs, and it can be actions that they want other stakeholders to take. So one of the most successful lines in a UN resolution or UN agreement was Agenda 21, Chapter 28, which asked local authorities to work with their local populations to produce their own local Agenda 21. And we had over 6,000 local Agenda 21s created between 1992 and 2002. It empowered local government to create a conversation locally on how to create sustainability strategies and plans. So these can be actions that you want other groups to take. It doesn't have to be just governments, it can be stakeholders as well.
Maybe I can here as well.
Go ahead.
Let's say in UNEA 3, I think it was, you had a resolution on plastics, on maybe having a legally binding convention. So that resolution was adopted by the member states, and then another process starts. So then they appoint 2 co-chairs or something, and then they have expert groups, and then they see what's going on. Then they come up with a report. It goes back again to the UNEA and see where they are. So it's a kind of ID of an action, and then member states can take it up. The problem with, if you have, because yesterday we talked also about having too many resolutions sometimes. I mean, it's one of the challenges of the UNEA, because if you have too many resolutions, it often happens that nothing is going to happen because it's just too much. Or you have resolutions that doesn't have really a budget coming together for doing it. That's another problem. So I mean, yeah, resolutions are very important, but it's mostly voluntary idea of member states to take action on something, but then after that a member state or the UN itself has to take a lead on that action.
So what are the things, someone said some of them are repetitive, and often the reason for that is the time you're working in. So we're in a very difficult time period because the state of the world at the moment, in particular governments. And so the ability to advance very far in many of the areas is very difficult. Often we're playing defense, particularly on climate change. And so that makes it very difficult to kind of move certain parts of the political agenda forward. And so what you do is you build up by repeating material, you ensure that isn't lost, that in a sense, you don't get people to be able to retreat further back. And then you try and add additional things that will move things forward. And then you create a system where it has to be monitored. So the Sustainable Investment Resolution, it's the first time the GA has had a resolution on sustainable investment. It deals with issues like trying to get companies to produce their environment, social and governance reports to make it, trying to move to a point where the UN's setting a date for all companies and stock exchanges to make it a listing requirement. So it's moving into areas that it hasn't done before in the context of trying to get the companies to become more accountable through the UN system as a whole. And we weren't able to get all of the things that we wanted in the first resolution, but we made it an annual resolution. So this year there'll be an opportunity to advance it a little bit more. But we work in a real world, and you can only advance things when the world kind of lines up like it did in 2015, and we were able to move the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. But behind that was 4 or 5 years of work that set that up, and a lot of that was repetitive work. And so repetitive work, unfortunately, is part of the way of building the blocks to enable the advancements.
We've got lots of questions coming in now. Lida, go ahead, and then if you want to say something, then I'll ask another question.
No, I see the questions as well.
Yeah. If you want to selectively answer questions, I'm happy for the two of you to scroll through and answer them if you'd prefer.
About resolutions, as I said, I mean, it's really an ID adopted by governments and then to take action on something, whatever issue. Then, as I said, someone has to take a lead. Sometimes it ends up in a legally binding thing. Well, that is really sometimes. Sometimes it ends up in a report. Sometimes it ends up in another process. So there is a question about mentioning Agenda 21 and the 2030 agenda being resolutions. It's also an action plan. I mean, it comes from a resolution, but then it ends up in an action plan that is adopted by the member states. So there
Felix,
is a difference between the resolution and the outcome.
any questions, Felix, you want to field? You want me to pick one?
Yeah, pick one.
Let's see. One of the last ones that's just come in. Sometimes people think that the UN agency has an ability to be a superpower agency over the world, but in essence, it's also reliant on individual country governments. Would you be able to shed light on this so that we understand the mechanism in the UN and how the agencies work?
Well, so think of the UN as an international civil service. So it's like your government civil service. The ministers in this case are the member states, and they make the decisions. They'll have specific roles. So you'll have a president of the General Assembly, which is Turkey, as Turkey's just taken over. You'll have Pakistan, I think, is the new chair of or the president of ECOSOC. So you'll have particular governments taking particular roles. As we know, Norway is the president of UNEP. So those are the political side of it, and the civil service, which is the UN agencies and programs, are there to deliver whatever the member states have asked them to do. So they don't do stuff unless member states have, in a sense, given them a mandate to do that.
Thank you, Felix. Another question. Are these keywords and language styles, do they cover the UN agencies, for instance,
Yes.
United Nations Human Rights Council?
Yeah. Sorry, Lydie, you can go.
No, I think it's exactly indeed. I mean, once you have this kind of knowledge on UNEA, you also have the same knowledge, I mean, necessary for following other UN processes, because it works more or less in every body the same. I mean, working with resolutions, having the same style of language, and also what is important, using the same references as well.
And one of the things that I think we've been very good at doing as stakeholders is bringing resolutions from other bodies into UNEA or in others. So where you can bring language. So a good example of this would have been issues on the right to water, which came up, I think, in the human rights arena. It had come up in the sustainable development arena, but it hadn't been agreed as a right until the Human Rights Council had, in a sense, made its decision. One was able to then bring it across, and it made it very difficult for, in this case, I think it was the United States and the UK, who didn't want to see the right to water included in any of the sustainable development agreements. Well, it would already been agreed, so we could use that to move the discussion forward.
Thank you, Felix. This is a good question here. As you mentioned, the Agenda 21 and also the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development are UN resolutions. What are other types of resolutions? Is a multilateral environment agreement a resolution?
It is. So if you think about it, even when you get a legally binding agreement, it starts off as a resolution. It starts off as a set of text, and the text is built up the way that I've suggested, and then you'll lose the PPs and the OPs, you'll lose the footnotes which reference the paragraphs that you built it up from previous agreements. When you're doing MEAs, what you'll do is you'll look at other MEAs to see how they've built up their legal framework with capacity building, tech transfer. There's a set of subterms if you're building up a legally binding agreement, which you would look to other agreements to start to build up your resolution from. But this is, in a sense, the start. Whenever you're trying to develop something, governments won't just take a piece of paper that says, this is what we would like to see. They'll want to see where have those paragraphs come from. They'll want to see it written in a way that makes it relatively easy for them to then move it forward. And when you're doing these things, it's enormously sensible not to have your organization's name on it, and just have it as what we call a non-paper or a non-resolution, so that in a sense they can copy it around and there's no kind of stakeholder fingerprints on it. And that makes it more accessible to countries who have problems with stakeholders actually getting engaged in policy making.
Thank you, Felix. We're running a little bit ahead, so I think there's time for one or two brief questions before we move on to the next section, because of course we want to answer as many questions as possible. Here's a good one. Is it possible to have the resolutions amended? For instance, the 2030 agenda does not have any emphasis around the sustainable population growth, unsustainable population growth. It has to be addressed to solve all the problems. How can multilateral agreements be amended, I suppose, is the question here.
Well, so in the context of the 2030 agenda, no, it's an agreement. But each year there is a ministerial declaration that comes out of the high-level political forum, and the 2030 agenda will stay the same as a document pretty much all the way up to 2030. It won't change. But in the 2030 agenda, there are a number of issues that are not the SDGs. The SDGs are the core part of the document, but then there's a whole lot of other issues like antibiotic resistance and human rights and other things that are sitting outside in the wraparound text. And there is a commitment to look at emerging issues. So if there was a feeling that the issue you wanted to take up, you saw as an emerging issue, you would then work to try and get some text into the ministerial declaration of the high-level political forum. That will be a way of doing it.
Thank you, Felix. We'll go with one more question. Let's see.
Well, there's the reference to existing documents happens in all of the document. And so where you can find either PP or OP paragraphs in any other resolution that has been passed in the UN system, you would drop it in. If it supports your text, it supports your argument, don't try and amend it. Just leave it as it is. Footnote where you've got it from, so that when you're sharing it with member states, they already can go to that. You will put a hyperlink in. They can go to that hyperlink, look at the document themselves, feel comfortable that they can then have that shared with colleagues.
Well,
it is always very important indeed to build on agreed language, because for member states often, especially the ones that are officials, for them it's easier to kind of agree on things that is already agreed before, instead of starting a negotiation again. And that's why it is also very important for us as NGO stakeholders to do our homework there as well and know what is already agreed, instead of asking things that are already agreed. So that's so that we can really use the several resolutions that were adopted in history, and there are a lot, and build on those so that we can go steps forward in this thinking.
Okay, I think we should probably move on now. Just can remind our audience, those who came in a bit late, that question should be put into the Q&A box rather than the chat box. So
just a point, they said, how do resolutions get agreed? Well, those are through the negotiations. In essence, most of the UN works on that everybody has to agree to it, but countries can take an option to footnote their disagreement. And so when we did the Rio+5 conference over the issue of water, I think Turkey and Egypt allowed the text to go forward, but took a footnote that they didn't agree with that particular text. So in theory, everyone's meant to agree, but you can develop it so that doesn't have to happen. When Stockholm happened in '72, Maurice Strong was the head of the conference, the first conference on environment, and it was the first time that China had participated in a UN meeting. And China, it was the last day, and there was a change in the text, and they really needed to get sign off from Beijing, but they couldn't do it in the timeline. And so they didn't vote against the resolution. They didn't walk out, which would have caused a real storm. They moved from the seats where they vote to the seats behind. And so they stayed in the room and were able to be shown to be there. And so you can use different ways of dealing with problems. Like I said yesterday, I got the United States to go to the toilet when the discussion on Johannesburg was being tabled so that they wouldn't vote against it.
Felix, thank you for that. With that, we'll move on to the next session. Felix, you're up again.
Yeah, sure.
Here we go, working with the media. We were asked about this yesterday. It's a very interesting module. Felix, over to you for now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you already do a lot of these things, but I just thought having a module with maybe some of the stories that we can tell around it, which would help you to look at it. So as I'm sure many of you already know, if you're doing a press release, you basically have 5 W's, you know, and those should be in your first paragraph. It should be, you know, who's involved in the news story, or the person or the organization or the company involved. It could be that you're criticizing a company. What's happening? What is it about? Well, what are you trying to achieve by this press release? When is this story happening? So particularly if you're going to put an embargo on it, so you say we're not going to allow you to use this story until X, then they need to know that that's the case. They also need to know when the story happened. So if you're telling a story about maybe some of a project that you've done, they need to know when that project would happen, or if it's in the future. Where is it happening? So, you know, my classic example is that I asked for political asylum at the Swedish embassy when I was involved in acid rain campaigning in the 1980s. I looked in the telephone directory. Of course, you don't know what telephone directories are now, but there used to be these big books with the telephone numbers in. And we put on the press release the address that was in the telephone directory. Unfortunately, in the previous year, the Swedish embassy had moved. And so our objective was to say that we are asking for political asylum because of the destruction of the trees in Sweden. When we found out that the embassy had moved, the press were already at where the embassy was. So the issue was that the press didn't report that we were asking for political asylum. They reported that we couldn't organize a piss up in the brewery. So we became a bit of a laughingstock. So be careful with what you're doing. Make sure all your facts are right. Why is this information relevant to the reader of these outlets? Can you put the next slide up? So, and it's a bit small here. So again, you'll have this when you can download the material. There's a kind of pyramid or inverted pyramid to the approach that you look at producing press releases. The first top of those 5 W's, which you in a sense set the scene. Those are really critical because a journalist will not go past that first paragraph if it's not interesting. It doesn't matter how great the rest of the stuff that you write is. If you haven't captured them in that first paragraph, then you're not going to be able to get them to take up your issue. The next paragraph gives, or the next part of the body of the text gives critical information and facts. And it's very important that your facts are backed up by science or by reports that show that you're accurate, so that they can, again, this is where you would footnote information that they can get access to. If it's ones that you've done yourself, that's great, but it's also very important if you can show that this is actually something that's represented in the IPCC report or the GEO report or others. And the tail information just gives you, in a sense, the information on how to contact you or other information that you want to put in there, which can be you know, links to websites and things like that. So that's very important. The next slide. So it depends where you are as far as journalists around the UN is concerned. And in New York and Geneva, they have a thing called the United Nations Correspondents Association. So if you Google that, you will actually find, particularly for New York, it's more difficult for Geneva, you will find the name of the journalist, the name of the body that it's working for, their telephone number, and their email. And so if you were going to the high-level political forum, it's actually very easy to set up meetings with the journalists because you have their information. And so that's something that's available for all of you. So if you end up engaging in the high-level political forum in any of the coming years, and that you are very much feel that you've got something to say, then you can do that. There is a press room which can be booked with the support of the UN to do press conferences, but it would have to be something that was really relevant to those. You can target, once you go through that, you can target your own journalists, the particular journalists that are ones that come from your country. So you don't have to approach all of them. For Nairobi, it's different. I couldn't find, and I should ask Alexander, I couldn't find a branch of the United Nations Correspondence and Association there. And I'm guessing that's because the UN or UNEP isn't operating throughout the year as far as meetings are concerned with member states and ministers. It kind of operates, as we know, UNEA is every 2 years. But there is a Foreign Correspondence Association for East Africa. And my guess is that that's where many of the journalists that are based in Nairobi would be in. So you can contact them to try and access some of the journalists. There's an African network of environmental journalists. So again, if one was working around Nairobi, that will be something. There's an association called the Earth Journalist Network, and they do have branches in certain countries in Asia. There's one in Pakistan, one in the Philippines, one in Indonesia. I couldn't see too many other ones, but it may be that they have on their within their organization individual journalists from countries that from your country and that you can get access to. Of course, in many cases, you know those. I'm sure they're journalists that are reporting on the environment in your newspapers or on your radio or in your TV. In certain cases, you can buy lists. So particularly for developed countries, there's a number of lists that exist where you can buy the journalists, or the science journalists. You get all of the science journalists for the UK or for the US, or you buy the list for all the transport journalists, or all those kinds of things. I don't know whether that exists within countries in Asia. It may do. It's worth looking at. It's expensive, but you can set it up so, yeah, as a coalition, you can buy the list for a short period of time, and essentially you already have it then and can use it. So when you're kind of thinking through your outreach, you want to look at what are the publications, the blogs, the podcasts that are relevant to you. Now, in the context of Nairobi, you will be looking at those in your own country that might take your news. So it may very well be that you can release information about, if you're working on plastics, for example, back to your own country. You've already, in a sense, mapped out the relevant publications. You've maybe linked in with the relevant journalist that might be interested. We talked about it earlier yesterday, where it's good to try and kind of get the journalists together before you go to a UNEA 5 to explain what's coming up, or at least the issues that you care about, so that they're primed for you to contact them as things develop. And it may be that you can, in a sense, be on a radio interview or a TV interview from there. There is facilities at UNEP to enable that to happen. UNEP does do some training for, at least for African journalists, and they do have a publication for a guide for environmental reporting for African journalists. That might be worth downloading that report and looking to see whether any of it's relevant for helping linking with the journalists in your country. It's not just the journalists that's important to link in with. What my experience has been is it's also important that whoever's editing the radio program or producing the radio program or editing the news sections that the environmental journalist is working under, it's important to build a relationship with those people as well, because they're gatekeepers to the information getting out. So they will be advising their journalists on whether they think it's an important issue. They will also be, in a sense, if they're doing program work, they will be people who will, yeah, if you've got a good relationship with them, you could find yourself coming on and being a regular on their discussion forums. Clearly, once you know the journalists, find their LinkedIn profiles, find their Twitter handles, get access to them so that they are within your media outreach, so that when you're putting stuff out, you're putting them on different platforms, because if they're very busy, they'll perhaps miss it on one. So it's useful to do it on all. If you have their telephone number, my advice is you can use it for your WhatsApp, but only use it very sparingly. If there's a real reason for contacting them because you're just about to do something which you think is going to be important, then use it, but don't use it, overuse it, because I think they don't tend to like that. If we use the next slide. So yeah, traditional media. Yeah, what are you going to do? Well, you need to have a map out, as we said, of the publications that you think might be interested in the issue that you're taking forward, and those are in your country. They may have a representative in Nairobi. It's highly likely that they won't, and so if you can build a relationship with the relevant local, national, international papers that are in your country that are being read, then that's really important. But it's also important to look on, in a sense, sector papers. So, for example, I did an article for the British Fish and Chip Shop magazine on sustainable fisheries, and that might seem a bit strange, and it is a bit strange, but it was a way of getting to the small and medium-sized businesses that are actually dealing with buying fish, and to try and ensure that they take up sustainability issues in the UK. And I have to say they are actually very, very good at doing that. So you can look at sectional publications as a way of getting your message across as well. There are political magazines, and those will be in your countries. In the UK, we have ones like the New Statesman. In the US, that have been in the news more recently because of President Trump. The Atlantic is a very good place to try and get publications. Politico, I managed to get some text into, I was quoted in Politico. So if you can get them into those particular areas, then that's really important. Radio plays, I think, a really important role, particularly in Africa and other developing countries. So if you can let your local radio station news team know that you're going to UNEA, and that that you would be very happy to bring them a story or have a discussion about how things are going, then that's something you can set up beforehand. If you build a good relationship with those, it pays off. So for Rio Plus 20, we had built such a good relationship with the BBC that the BBC was sharing our flat with us, and we're actually broadcasting their daily broadcasts from the flat that we were sharing. And so we were influencing quite heavily what the BBC thought was going on in the summit, which we thought we were very happy about. So focus on not just news programs, because not everybody listens to that. If there's an opportunity to go into music programs, find an angle, that's always useful as well. If we could move to the next slide. So the way you engage with the traditional media is through press releases. We've discussed it. Video or radio releases, where you can release a small story, particularly for radio, small stories about projects you're involved in. We've always found very useful. When you're sending out your press release, have a nice fact sheet behind it that can go and help them. Try and get an op-ed. And the op-eds can be around a number of things. It can be around that UNEA 5 is happening, and these are the critical issues you think are important. And if you've built the relationship, they may very well take that. But it can also be around UN days. So if you're doing water, it could be around UN Water Day, which is, I think, the 22nd or 23rd of March. It can be around UN Environment Day, and around these days there's a large amount of material. FAO's 75th anniversary is coming up, I think, on the 16th of October, so a lot of groups are thinking about doing stuff if they're working in agriculture or food issues around doing something around the 75th. It's a big day, so it may very well be something that journalists will take forward. Press conference. Well, now that we have kind of webinar opportunities, you can offer the press a press conference that's virtual. And that may be a lot easier than getting them to turn up to a physical location. They may be prepared to come in. Keep it short, keep it down to no more than half an hour, maybe speak for 5 or 10 minutes and open it up. Keep it energetic and interesting. There are a number of list servers that you can put material out. We've mentioned the IISD list server as something that you should be looking at. There's ones on climate, there's ones on water, they have one on energy, they have one on the SDGs. Why is that important? Because a lot of journalists sign up to those as well. And if you're not yet looking at what happened at the last UNEA meeting, UNEA4, which will give you the photographs of all the people who were there, and you'll be able to possibly see the photographs of your representatives, but you'll also get an idea about how UNEA operates. It's well worth doing. As I say, linking with journalists, if you can, depending on your country, if there are key bloggers who take an interest in environment. And again, if you can cross over into music or other areas where those bloggers are prepared to do something. We worked with Rachel McAdams, who's been in the recent Eurovision film. We worked with her because she used to run a website called, Green Girls Are Sexy, where she did a lot of work on environment. She's a very environmentally active Canadian actress. And we got her to do on our newsletter a daily column based on the work that group was doing. So if you can get some celebrity help, that also makes it really good. Build up in a sense of virtual hub of your material for the journalists to be able to access. So don't just see these as one-off things, see it as an opportunity to have the material there so that you become a resource for them to go. And where possible, and it's not always possible because organizations have different people who focus on different areas. If you can try and create a couple of people who are more recognized as opposed to changing those people each time with a different campaign, it means that you build in a sense, a figurehead for the organization as far as the media is concerned. And also that person gets much more experience. There is media training that you can do where you can go through how to present yourself on the radio or how to present yourself on television. That's definitely worth doing if you can, and if you have access to some journalists who might help you do that. The next slide. So we mentioned IISD. There are also Google groups on different issues that you can join as getting your message out. Those can be ones which are relevant to your country or more generally. There are issue newsletters that you can get your message out at UN meetings. Third World Network puts out an excellent newsletter during the climate negotiations, as does the Climate Action Network. Stakeholder Forum used to have a daily newsletter called Outreach. And during UNEP, there is now a one on plastics that comes out every day, I think. And that's, I think, produced by SEAL now, or at least the editors from SEAL, Centre for International Environmental Law. It's well worth producing something for a UN meeting which has your particular issues forefront, because people have time to read. And so I think, if you can work in a coalition to produce something, that's really important. When you know who your journalists are, as we said, link in with them, also Instagram them, Twitter them, those are all important. Next one. So your next slide. So that's a Ralph Steadman cartoon on the right-hand side, who did a very famous British artist. And that was his interpretation of the 1992 Earth Summit, which was, I think, quite controversial at the time. But you also have a lot of things that you produce, and the important thing is to create that as a whole, so that in fact the journalist can access your material, but can also be updated. So, you know, if you're going to UNEA 5, then, you know, if start blogging on some of the things that you're thinking of doing, in a sense, from now, so that there's in a sense some material available for the journalists to do. Again, Stakeholder Forum used to produce a monthly newsletter as a way of getting to journalists and keeping them up to date. Podcasts have become very popular as a way of getting out. It takes a while to build up a membership of that, but one of the ways of doing that is to work with other podcasts that are already there, or to look for people who you can interview on particular issues who will be really keen to promote that they were on your podcast. So if you're coming as someone who's engaged on plastics, then you could you'd have interviews with the minister, or you could have interviews with local people who are dealing with plastic pollution in their community, and you can start to build up a clientele that is interested in that. If we can move to the next one, because I'm realizing I'm taking too long. There's a way of integrating your social media together. This is one of them. There are a number of platforms that you can use where you can set it up so that, in a sense, the material goes out every day, every week, every fourth day, and that it will go to all the relevant platforms that you have. That's a really good way of reducing your need to have to place to do them all yourself. You move to the next one, please. So a small example of a success, and it's a really interesting one because it plays into our attention span being relatively limited. It's WWF's Earth Hour, where they asked individuals and businesses to turn off their lights for an hour to tackle climate change. So 2017 was their 10th anniversary, and it was hashtag Earth Hour, and it generated 2 billion impressions in 2017. I haven't got the more up-to-date figures. That's quite a big amount of people who are taking part. Now, you're not absolutely sure that they're going to do it, but you can quantify and say this is the likely impact as far as reduction in CO2 is concerned. Created a unique image for what they were doing, which could be copied and sent relatively easily. And because it was just a single hour you were asking people in a very busy day, it was actually a really easy thing for them to engage in. We could have the next slide. So the next slide, again, you can't see this very well. I'm sorry about that, but you'll have it available. What I've done, and this wasn't done by me, it was done by James from Islands Innovation, who've actually doing this week have been doing a Islands virtual summit with over 10,000 people participating. And I went on his course for learning how to use these platforms. So down the left-hand side, you see some of the different platforms that are available. Zoom is the one we're doing, tells you as you go across the page, the number of participants, the time limit you're allowed on for the money you're paying, whether you get a transcription of the outcome of the discussion. So we can get a transcription of everything we've said here, and then you can use that to edit. So for example, on Monday, we're launching at 9 o'clock this report on HLPF Fit for Purpose. We didn't have to listen to the tape. We had to do some editing, but the Zoom thing just transcribed all of the words that we had said, and then we were able to spend a relatively short period of time editing that. Does it have a good security? Well, Zoom doesn't, as we all know. I've been bombed a couple of times at the World Water Week last week, so they're trying to improve that. Can you join by a phone call? Does it have an AI assistant? And so some do, some don't. And then what I put there, well, what James has put there is basically what the cost of those particular platforms are. And then there are a number of other platforms that you can use. If you could move to the next slide. I think this is the last one on this one. So there are for meeting platforms, again, there's the Zoom meeting platform, there's the WebEx. Remo is an interesting one, and I've participated in a couple of them. One of the advantages of Remo is that you can actually go to, in a sense, a coffee bar, and you can have up to 8 people sitting around a table. So it feels a little bit more like what you would be doing if you went into a coffee bar. So it has some very interesting different features. There are other platforms like GoToMeetings, Google Hangouts, Skype for Business. And the one which I've been very impressed with is one called Hopin. And the UN Global Compact have used that. And it has a very interesting, I guess, platform. So you have it where you have the agenda on the left-hand side, so you can go to the plenary sessions, or you can scroll down into the different side events that are happening. And then it has this very interesting thing, which is called networking. And you go into this, you click in on the networking, you end up in a room, and then you click, and then randomly it selects someone for 3 minutes for you to talk to. And then as it's doing that, you have the option to, if you think they're really interesting, to click on their LinkedIn and then ask them to be your friend, so you could continue after that 3 minutes. So it's a very interesting platform. The other one is Verbella. Verbella is basically where you go in and you have a virtual version of yourself, and you go into a campus and you walk around the campus, and you can go into meeting rooms, you can go to stalls and things. It's a bit chunky, and it needs you to download a huge amount of stuff onto your computer to be able to run it. So it's not very friendly to places where they have low internet connections. But it's an interesting new development, which I'm sure over time will increase. Okay, that's me finished, I think, for this module.
Yes, Felix, it is. And it's now time for some more questions. Let's see. I'll remind our audience that questions should please be put in the Q&A box rather than in the chat box. Let's see, we have anything coming in, anything new? Nothing new yet. So let's give our audience a chance to put some questions in before we move on to the next section.
So just someone said something on the UNEP creating a UN Correspondence Association for Nairobi. As I say, I don't know that it doesn't exist, but as it's not a situation where the journalists will be there every single day, it would be a slightly different model, I think they go. And it's not the role of UNEP to do that. It's the role of the journalists to set it up for themselves, I think.
Okay, here we go. Can engaging, so thank you. Let me see. Can engaging in the comment sections of important online environmental articles or news help in getting media attention? For instance, social media handles, blogs, and websites.
So I mean, I think it does no harm in commenting on articles that you see, but I think it's not a hugely effective in getting your message across. I'm not sure how many people will read those. I would focus on building relationships with the journalists.
Okay, let's see. Can you share some of your experiences having an interview? Any tips for us? I can let Felix answer first, and then Lida can share some of her experiences.
I think I was on Sky News where I equated Perez de Cuellar with a snooker player, which I think went down really well. I think the issues on being interviewed, and I mean, we can send you a couple of links to, I've done a number of interviews as a TV program that comes out of the UN, and I've done a number of interviews there. I think, you know, the important thing is your preparation, that you need to know exactly what you want to get across before you go into the room. Don't go into the room without having worked out what is the message that you want to get across. And particularly if those interviews are going to be short, you have to think, I'm going to be asked a particular question. It might be, you know, what do you think UNEP should do on plastic? And so what is your answer? Is it that you think there should be a legally binding agreement? Whatever the issue is, have a very clear idea about what your answer is going to be. They're going to then come back to you because, yeah, they won't just let you promote your own things. They'll then come back and look to you to back that up with some form of evidence. So if you say that you want to create, the UNEP should start a process, or the UNEA 5 should start a process for a plastics convention. Why are you saying that? Why is it needed? Well, then you need to have the facts on how much plastic is out there in the ocean. So you need to have the information behind that, that you can then say, well, you know, we're basically eating microplastics because it's getting into the fish and into the food and everything. And then you start to try and paint something which is a strong case for what you're trying to do.
Yeah, maybe some of my experiences as well. I think indeed is how Felix said. I mean, it's very important to be prepared, also to really have your message already. Sometimes I even did not really answer exactly the question because it confuses you often. So I think it's very good to have your message and just say that, and then try to kind of take over the interview so that it's your message that becomes the lead in the interview instead of the other way around. It is also very important to be short because an interview on the radio is often nothing more than 1-2 minutes. So you don't have 20 minutes to explain your case and everything and the context, etc. So sometimes you have to be short and bold. What is important also is to have some illustrations of very impressive facts. Like I think WWF is often doing quite well. I mean, the kind of saying when you eat in bank cards a year on plastics, with plastic that is in your food, or the things that in 2000, I don't remember the year, we have more plastic in the ocean than fish. I mean, this kind of things, do people remember? I mean, that's something that is very important in radio interviews. But it's I think for me, when I talk about my personal experience, it's just doing it. My first interview was bad. The second was better, and now I'm kind of getting used to it. So it is also the fear you have for the microphone and everything in the radio studio. It's always quite impressive, but I mean, after 3 times doing it, it feels more comfortable. So just do it and go for it and
because we
failures as well.
Yeah, because we've got this technology now that we're using, there's no reason why as a group you can't get practice by, in a sense, doing your own Zoom version of it internally, where you have someone in, because at least in the short term, it's likely to be, a short to medium term, it's likely to be done by Zoom anyway. So, you know, you can very easily just set up a 2-way discussion and your colleague will ask you questions. And so you can try and hone that down before you actually end up having to go into an interview.
Thank you both. We got some more good questions. Is it possible to pay freelance journalists or freelance bloggers to prepare articles or op-eds in relation to themes? Is this ethical?
Well, there's one of the biggest platforms is freelancer.com, where you can take people on from all over the world to do pretty much anything you want. That's an interesting question. You have to, each of the organizations have to decide whether you want to use people from your country, people who are experts on doing that. So I think it's ethical to use freelancers if they are, because the advantage of freelance journalists is that they know how to write for papers. We don't necessarily know how to do that. That's not necessarily our skill. So there's nothing wrong with, in a sense, paying someone who has got that skill. The UNEP often will use BBC journalists to come in and rewrite their reports so that they are written in a particular way that's much more attractive and written in a way that's more readable. So using people who can do that. I have a copy editor who does my books, so I write them, and I'm dyslexic, so it's slightly problematic, and that person rounds it off for me, makes it makes me sound a little bit more intelligent than I am.
I can't imagine that's possible. Some more good questions. Social media is going strong to create awareness. May we use social media?
Lida, go.
Yeah, I think social media is very interesting, of course. I mostly see it as mobilizing, because we often are connected on social media with the ones that are already kind of like-minded, because you're in the same circles. That doesn't say that it's not important to use social media, but I think if you want to reach also, let's say, the people in the streets, etc., I think then I would also go for the more traditional press, I mean newspapers. But also I think what is very important, and Felix raised it as well, is to have this kind of very, I don't know, I would not use the word low, but I mean smaller magazines. I mean that really is reaching the I mean in my case, let's say I use also our neighborhoods newspaper. I mean it goes out to, let's say, 400 people, but it really reaches the people that I want to reach with the message that I have. I mean the environmental issues, etc. So I think you should see where you want where you want to deliver your messages.
We have time for one or two more. Here's another very good one. Most of the media is guided by political ideology. How do we make our work neutral?
Well, our work isn't neutral. We have we have a particular viewpoint that the planet should survive and we should be able to live sustainably. That is a political position. And then other people have a viewpoint that let's just party between now and when we die and leave the rest of the mess to our sons and daughters, mostly our sons. So I think don't assume that everything is political. And so, you know, the difference depending on your country will be on what regulations you have on the press, on whether they have to have some fair and balanced debates. In the US, President Reagan took away that fair and balanced requirement when he was president, and that's why we've ended up with Fox, but also why we've ended up with MSNBC and CNN. I mean, though I watch all three of them, you know, they are all of a political persuasion, whether it's on the left or whether it's on the right. If the objective of news is to be objective, then you need to have a situation where you have regulation that makes those news have both sides. That doesn't mean on climate change that there is two sides, because clearly there isn't, you know, because 98% of scientists say climate change is happening, 2% don't. So if you're going to have fair and balance, you'd have 98 scientists in the room for the press conference supporting action on climate change, and you'd only have 2 on the other side.
Thank you, Felix. I think we should probably move on to the next section, and that will be delivered by Lida. So Felix, you're muted. Thank you. Lida, you have the floor on fundraising tips.
Yes. Thank you. As you all know, fundraising is very difficult, very challenging. And so that's why we try to give you some tips in helping you in finding the funding for all the things that you are doing. Because it's also important for your surviving, not only as a person, but mostly also as an organization. So we made a checklist. First of all, it is very important for all the NGOs, the social movements, or community-based organizations, that you are eligible to apply for a funding. Often that means that you have to have a legal entity, you have to be an organization that is registered in your country. Of course, that is in every country different, but it is really important to find out if you are indeed eligible to apply for funding. It is also important that you identify the right timelines to apply. Many funders, they have their own ways of asking for proposals for projects, etc. So it's important that you know when you can apply for a funding or not. If you have a particular funder or government or whatever on your radar, then it's interesting and important to know who is that person who is going to review your project. Have you spoken to this person? I mean, do you know what are the priorities, etc.? It's very important to find that out before you start writing a proposal. This has to do, of course, also with the priorities set by the funder. You have funders that, that more and more, I would say, are quite explicit in what they want to fund. That can be capacity building, that can be only water issues, that can be only environmental rights issues. So it is important to know what are the priorities set by the funder. If you write an application, you have to see, I mean, if you use the language that is clearly reflected and covering the priorities of the specific funder. So don't write a project proposal and then send it to several funders. Often you really have to write it exactly, I mean, targeting that specific funder. It is also important that you, when you work with other organizations, or if you have targeting several groups that you want to work with, that you inform them, of course, on forehand. So don't put in your proposal that you're going to work with that or that neighborhood or that community if that community is not aware yet of your ID. So it's very important to, of course, to have them involved from the very, very beginning. Another thing that is important is that you can show that your organization is able to meet the financial management requirement. So if you are an organization with 2-3 people, very locally based or whatever, it's kind of impossible to ask for funding, which is $500,000 a year, because you don't have the financial management. Or you have to, or you can work with other organizations that are bigger, or at least have an administration section where they can help you with the financial management. Next one. It is also important that you have a good knowledge of the specific requirements of a potential funder. Maybe often funders have their own format for applying for a project. So you have to know what it is. If you have contact, of course, and have already a relationship with the funder, then of course you will know what those requirements are. It's for many funders, they like to have that because they also have their own checklists in reviewing a project proposal. So if it's not exactly according to their requirements, they can often just refuse it, reject it. As I said, don't write a project proposal according to your own ideas, your own logic, your own way of working, because that doesn't work with funders. It has to be very specific and targeted on the funder. What is also good to be aware of is their time schedule in case you are funded, the time schedule on how they pay the project. Sometimes it's 50% on forehand and 50% afterwards. So you have to know that your organization can deliver on the project, even if it's for the beginning only financed for 50%. So you need to have some financial buffer in your own organization to deliver it. Because many funders, especially when it's about governmental funders like the EU, European Commission, they often pay 6-7 months after the project has finished. So that means that you need to have those this cash flows. Next slide. What is important is to create a relationship with the funder. There are many projects, so funders are changing a little bit their policies. Where before you could send a project proposal to a funder and then they reviewed it and they said yes or no, whatever. That is changing. A lot of funders are now also having their own policies. They also start to work together. They pool their money. For instance, on the plastic, the McCarthy Foundation, they asked many other funders to put money together and kind of forced all the organizations working on plastic to work together as well, so that they really could have an international impact, because funders are also making evaluations of their own work, and they see, well, it doesn't work very well if we finance project 1 and then project 2, project 3. So you can keep on funding this kind of projects. So they force also the organizations to work together to have a bigger impact. But then they also see that it's better for them also to pool their money. So to put one big grant for also a network of organizations to have a bigger impact. I think that's a good thing, because it makes you think as an organization also to have a bigger impact and also more a long-term impact. It helps you also because you can then have projects for 3-4 years instead of having projects of six months or 1 year, which when you also know that once the project stops, it doesn't have a lot of effect anymore afterwards. So it's also better to have this kind of long-term thinking and acting. But for that, you need to know the foundation's priorities and the way of working. So you need to do a lot of work before Google and search and etc. So know who is the person and having their emails, etc., etc. It is important to, if it's possible, to have personal meetings with the foundation as well, so that you can really explain on what you're up to, what is your long-term vision, what is your mission, and with whom you are working, to kind of convince the foundation or the funder to work with them. You can also engage people from the foundation or others that have more experience in helping you in designing the project. You have, I mean, as I said, you have several formats, you have the kind of language that they use. So I think it's important to have that in mind as well. Next one. So in summary, search for grants that are available for your nonprofit organization, so that are really fit for purpose, and not just sending around your projects, because that is absolutely not useful. And it even, I think, can get back to you, because it's if you send a project several times to the same funder without really knowing what their priorities are, I think the next time your project just goes directly to the bin, because they know that, okay, there we have them again with the project. So I think it's good to not do that and really do your homework before. For knowing the funder, it's also good to read the previous grantees projects that they have, so that you know more or less in what kind of things they are in. Is it something that that is kind of process oriented? Do they really want to have very concrete deliverables, like having a report or a conference or whatever? That is important to know. Again, review the requirements for the grants, know the timeline for the applications, and really have tailored applications for each grant. Of course, you can copy paste from the project that you have, but I mean, you really have to follow their guidelines and not your own, let's say, logic. If it's possible, seek a connection between board members of a leader, of a member, and someone of your staff to have that grant making foundation known. The next one. Most of the things I said was about, private foundations, but of course you also have national and subnational governments that are giving grants as well. Especially I think in the global north, we have that tradition that you can ask money from the governments. I don't know if that's in all countries the same. But departments of ministries that are worth looking at are the ones of development, which is international development, but can be also national. Environment, of course, foreign affairs, several missions in your country. You have often small grants from embassies or missions in your country. That are often grants for very small activities, very concrete activities, but can be very helpful, of course. Trade and industry and local governments. I mean, cities also often give grants for also quite concrete actions. More difficult is, especially for smaller organizations, is to have entrances in national development banks, but it doesn't say that it's not possible. But there again, the same tips would apply, that you really have to know on forehand on what they are willing to support and how it's working, and what are the requirements, also the legal requirements to be able to apply for this kind of funding. Next one. You also have UN agency and other intergovernmental bodies. So you have the Global Environmental Facility, which is the UNDP. They have small grants programs for NGOs and community-based organizations. Often they have a maximum on that. It's not that super big, but it can be very helpful also as a kind of co-funding for other funders you are looking at. Multilateral development banks, World Bank, regional development banks, I think that's only possible if you're a bigger organization. I don't think that they start funding really grassroots organizations with small projects. But if you can work with other organizations in your country, having a coalition of organizations, then you can always approach them. European Union, they have several ways for grants. DG Environment, DG stands for Director General Environments. You have the LIFE program, which is on environment, but it's really environment in Europe. So it's if you have projects in your countries, in your region on environmental issues, that doesn't work in this LIFE program. So it has to be protecting the environment in Europe. It would work in DG Development, which is about international cooperation and development. It's a development cooperation instrument, but there again, it is a requirement to have contacts with a European organization, be it Oxfam, be it whatever. I mean, a development organization in Europe, based in Europe, and then have a coalition. It's often a kind of international coalition where you can work there as well. DG Research, that's an DG that is financing research work. The program is called Horizon 2020. It's a kind of interesting channel for funding. But it's about research, of course, but it's a coalition. It has to be in coalition between universities and grassroots organizations, NGOs. That can be international, that can be only European. It is a kind of lottery because it is, they have a lot of money, but they also have a lot of universities that apply for it. Often the lead organization is a university. But as they are always looking for NGOs to be part of it, because it's one of the obligations for universities to work with civil society organizations in this research program, that can be quite interesting. But with all the EU financing, it's quite complicated, and you have to pre-finance because the money comes in quite late. I think the channels for the European Union is more appropriate for the bigger organizations that have already a lot of experience in financial management and also working with, with different currencies. The FAO, Food and Agriculture Organizations, they have projects for, of course, agriculture and fisheries and technical assistance. It's really worthwhile looking at it as well. UNEP also gives grants. One of the grants is for us, I mean, in just to give an example, to have this capacity building webinars for you. World Health Organization and the UN Democracy Fund. I think if you are interested in looking for UN funding, I think the best you can do is really go to their websites and see what is possible. Next one. But also large NGOs can be approached. Of course, we all know Oxfam, especially for the developing countries. Oxfam is financing several grants in the south. WWF as well, IUCN, Christian Aid, it's not Christina Aid, but Christian Aid, CAFOD. I mean, you have many development organizations that are financing, but there again, it's not about, okay, sending them a project proposal and then just wait. I mean, it's really about building the relationship. I worked myself for 10 years in development cooperation sector. I often received projects kind of out of the blue from, I mean, I don't say that they were not very interesting projects, but I mean, you can't just give an answer to all these proposals. So it's very important there again to have a relationship built on forehand and then see what you can do together. So it's really about kind of building partnerships instead of sending a proposal from an organization that needs help or support to an organization that is in the funder capacity. Within science, Future Earth, the national science bodies, they also have grants for research projects. Private sector also have their foundations. Of course, there it's always tricky. I mean, I think there you have to be very aware of what kind of foundation it is, and if it's for your organization, if you want to have private sector funding as well. I mean, a lot of organizations in Europe, they have in their mission and in their, let's say, their constitutes that they don't accept money from the private sector. But that's up to you, of course, to decide. And then again, as I said, subnational and local governments also have often grants to give out, but mostly for very concrete projects. Next one. What is new and helps quite good, I think, is the crowdsourced side. So crowdfunding is something that is working in many countries. In other countries, it's not. Me, myself, I was involved in a crowdfunding organization for having money for legal assistance in community-based organizations that were in environmental conflicts to finance their lawyers, their legal assistance for often the fights, court cases they had with big multinationals. That worked quite well. It worked quite well in Holland, but it didn't work in Belgium. So it's really also something that is culture based or whatever. That's some countries or some people in countries are more open for crowdfunding than others. But I do see a lot of very positive things. It's often for startups. I mean, SMEs to kick off their business, their small business. But also on a lot of social and political fights as well. As I said, the thing that I was doing was on having the legal assistance for environmental conflicts. So we had cases in, maybe you know them in Nigeria, where the local communities were in fights with Shell. In Ecuador, where the indigenous people were fighting against Texaco. They even won the case, but then Texaco, of course, they have much more lawyers than we could ever crowdfund together. But at least, I mean, you give them an opportunity to fight for something. And a lot of people are really into that. I mean, they want to give 20, 50, 100 euros to fund that, to support that local fight. So crowdfunding is really something you can look into. And it's you have several platforms already where you can just ask to be part of. Next one. Writing on projects is just as writing press articles, etc. It's also a kind of profession. I mean, it's really good also. I mean, if you're not familiar with doing it, to ask someone for advice. There are, especially in European project proposals, there are already people that are so used to all the requirements that the EU is asking. So do you have people that are consulting and helping to write the project proposal exactly in the format that in this case the EU wants. So don't hesitate to ask advice there as well. Because it's as many things, it's a profession on its own. This is just a very short outline on what should be in. Of course, the project name. The project name has to cover what it's about, the background and the project rationale. If you send a proposal, then be aware of the fact that the people you are sending it to, even if you already have a good relationship, they need really this kind of background and the really the aim of your project. Objectives, of course, the aims and the target groups. So for whom is it? For whom is the project, for what, and etc. Activity, and also to be concrete, so as concrete as possible, and also have the direct outputs connected with the activities. For that, it's always very useful to use a log frame, which is a logical framework. It helps you also for your own, let's say, your own interest, to see what is the logic in this project. So what do I want to do? For whom is it? What are the concrete activities and why? So every time ask yourself the why and for whom. If you have that right, then it's easier to have your objectives right, structures, your activities that are related to the activities, your outcomes that are related to the activities and the output. So it's really very helpful also for yourself to start with that logical framework, and to fill that in. Of course, what cannot be missed in a project proposal is the budget per year and over more years. If it's a longer project, then it's also good to have that. Most of the funders, they never finance 100% of the project. So you have to be, you also have to inform who is co-funding it, if it's yourself and where does it come from, or if you have other partners where it is. So just split up your budgets in who is going to finance what in the ideal case. I think that's it. Yes.
Well, thank you. And Felix, I see you're back in. That was very comprehensive, a lot of information for our audience to work with. So why don't we start with the questions that we have. Let's see. First, comment and question. Writing a grant application in itself is a skill. What are the parameters to put in mind when writing an application, and what makes a winning application scale through when targeting a specific funder or donor? So what makes a winning application? Who wants to take that one?
I'll do it, but I wanted to comment on a couple of other things. So I think, yeah, Lyda's right. Part of it is the development of the relationship over time with a particular funder, and it is a skill. So again, this is something where at different points, it's better to get someone in who can write the proposal. So stakeholder forum, when we were doing the European Health and Environment Forum, back to back with the WHO UNEP conference in London, we took on a EU funder a guy who fundraised from the EU, and they did that first application for us, so that was useful. But I mean, I'm always a kind of believer that you know, you develop a project similar to what Lida talked about, that 2-pager, as a discussion document with the funder. So if you've got the relationship, you take a 2-pager in and you start to have a conversation with them about what you're trying to do. And then they become a co-designer with you of it, so that then when it goes back in, so I had a very large Ford grant to set up with a colleague, the Communitas, a coalition that focused on SDG 11 for the SDGs. And we had a proposal, a 2-pager, we went in, spoke with the relevant part of the Ford Foundation that dealt with cities, and then we co-designed the proposal so that they helped us to some, in some respects, to get it to a level that we probably wouldn't have got it to if we had just sent it in. But they had a good idea of how to get it through the board meeting that would make the final decision, because they don't make the final decision, they make the recommendations of proposals to the board. So that co-design was really important. We're at the moment doing a proposal on MEAs, which we've sent a 2-page to the Swiss government to have a look at. And I was very clear that we want to co-design the proposal with them. And so if you do that and you get them involved, they also then can become a group which will go out and seek other funding for you because they want the project to go ahead. So I think that's very important.
Yeah. It's indeed, I mean, and also with governments, especially with I mean, I'm more familiar, of course, with the European Union and Western, I mean, European governments. Some of them are quite progressive in thinking, so they want things to be that they are happening, but they can't do it themselves because they are part of the government. So they often also see NGOs as some kind of, okay, well, if you want to do it, if you want to start this discussion. I remember very well that at that time, Potocznik, who is now the co-chair of the IRP, the International Resource Panel, he was really into capping the use of resources. And I mean, sometimes he still says it because he's now not a commissioner anymore from the EU. So he really facilitated money for our organization so that we could start that discussion. And having the papers done and everything, and then he could use, so okay, the NGOs want this, but of course it was, I mean, he kind of guided it, but we were lucky with having him as commissioner. But I mean, it's really, as Felix said, and I said earlier, it's very important to have a good relationship with, in this case, the commissioner, governments, or a foundation.
Just a couple of other things on that. I set up the Water and Climate Coalition with the Stockholm International Water Institute to get water into the UNFCCC because it didn't exist. There was no text on water, which is ridiculous considering the impact of climate change. The funding came from DFID in the UK, even though the UK government had policy against what we were trying to do in the energy ministry. But the development ministry knew that this was a good, important thing, and they couldn't win the battle in the government. So they funded us to basically do the argument globally, which then allowed the UK to come inside and work with us. One other thing on the companies thing. So Lida's more of a purist than I am, but I think you have to think that there are different types of companies. So, you know, going to Shell or BP for funding probably isn't a good idea, but going to the renewable companies, who are the people who we want to see doing things, are very, very important. Going to the companies that will replace plastics and actually getting them to help support running your campaign is very, very important. The work I did on the GA resolution on getting companies to have to produce their environment, social and governance reports were funded by Aviva. And why did Aviva want to know that? They're an insurance and pension company. They wanted to know what the company's futures look like because they weren't getting that information through the normal reporting process. So they wanted to force those companies to report on that so they could work out whether their investments would be secure in those companies. So sometimes you can find people who are, the companies that are going to be part of the solution. And those should be companies, I think, that you should seek funding from.
Yeah, that's true. Although, yes, I am more purist on that.
You are.
I always was part of the environmental activists movement. So yeah, you have more reluctant in receiving money from the private sector. From the questions, I see a question that if there's software to prepare proposals, I think there are maybe not to prepare one proposal, because as I said, I mean, it's really, you have to really have a tailored proposal for any funder you want to approach. But what is important, and there is software for that, is to design your log frame. It's very important to really see, well, this is what I want. Those are those are my objectives. Those are the instruments. I mean, the strategy I want to use, and this is my target audience, etc. So it gives you I mean, it forces you to really see it as a logical thing. So not only, well, this is what I want and this is what I'm going to do, but there has to be a relationship between this is what I want and this is what I do, and this is the strategy I'm going to use. So I think there it's useful to really have that log frame, and there is software for that. I don't know if I know that in LinkedIn you have some groups that are focusing on funding. So maybe it's good to see somewhere there in your own, I mean, your own context in your own country, if there is a LinkedIn group that is available for you. Because I think that's where, at least for the European fundings, there is a group on that, so that's very useful. There is even for the EU, and I'm not sure if it's for your countries as well, a kind of dating site, I would say, which is the funders and the ones that need the money. So you can also see there what is maybe appropriate for your organization. But it's not simple. I mean, most of the organizations, they have one person full time for searching for funds. So it is, as I said, it is a profession. It's the same as having a communication officer in your organization. Most of the organizations also have a fundraiser in the organization, because it is quite time consuming, and I mean, having the relationship with them, and also the search for it.
Thank you both. A couple of interesting questions here. One, Felix might take particular interest in this. As a filmmaker, getting funds for documentaries and films for environmental matters are often difficult. Do you have any guidance on that?
Yeah, I'm going to be looking for funding for my Bigfoot and Sustainable Development Goals project once we're through this process. There is a environmental documentary association which might be worth engaging with. I haven't engaged with them, but I mean, the reality is that if you've got a good pitch, there are so many additional platforms available now to put your work on that, you know, it's about developing a pitch to go to the potential platforms you want to do it. Ford Foundation does give grants out for documentaries, so the Ford Foundation would definitely be worth going to look at. They have a whole process there which they do fund documentaries, so that will be one place. But it also it's being able to get it in front of potential places you want to have it shown, and then get them to fund it. Netflix, Amazon, or iTunes, all of these things are going to just grow over the next period of time. They're all creating huge amounts of new material, or looking for whole lots of new material to go on their platform.
Thank you, Felix, and for both of you. Good question about volunteers. Any guidelines on raising a strong volunteer force to work on projects?
Yeah, I was just typing the answer here. I will just click on send. I think, yeah, we did not include that in our webinar, but it's indeed very important as well. to have, because it's a kind of funding, it's a kind of in-kind funding, so to have more human resources to do your projects. I know that you have the VSA, the voluntary service, I don't know where,
Overseas.
abroad, VSO, sorry. I think they're also working with a lot with volunteers. But again,
UNV, United Nations Volunteers, based in Bonn.
Yeah, you have several ones, but maybe it's a good idea to include that in our next webinar, because it's really for smaller organization very helpful to have that resource as well.
I mean, the other thing is also with depending on your organization, whether you can have a relationship with a larger organization who might do an in-kind contribution to help you develop those log frames and things.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. I can jump in just for a
yeah,
minute.
there was also the question if we can approach us to review the concept notes. I'm not so.
No, I think that
Yes,
would be hugely.
It would be a full-time job, I think. But yeah, I mean, I think it's more like Felix says. I mean, if you have bigger organizations around you, you can, and it's even good to ask someone who is not into writing project proposals, because it's often if someone else that is not into your area understands where you really want to do, then you can suppose that the fundraiser, it also understands it.
And I've just realized we forgot to put something on the overheads. There's a thing called sdgfunders.org. sdgfunders.org is a platform for all of the funders that are funding the SDGs. It was set up by Rockefeller Philanthropic. It has on their website a list of all of the foundations, where they're funding which SDG. And so you can go there and see. And then what they've done in certain places is they've created platforms. So there is a platform in, I think, Indonesia of all the grant-making bodies that are engaged in the SDGs. There's one in Ghana. There's one for the Arab region, because the problem was setting them up in individual countries because of the legal issues. So they set it up for the region. So I think those will be places to look for. And what you can't apply to that for money, but that will tell you who's funding in your area. So it will give you a list of those foundations, which SDGs they're funding, and how much they're investing in those areas.
But then again, even if you have a website from a funder, just don't send your proposal out of the blue to those funders. But first, I mean, all the things that we said, first contact them, try to know them, try to meet them, etc., before you send your proposal. That's very important.
We've finished the 10 minutes we usually allocate. We're a little bit ahead of schedule. Felix and Lada, do you want to take a quick scroll through the questions and see if there's one or two more you can answer before we take our break?
I'm reading the questions now.
Maybe take one each.
So on UNEP, no, they don't have that. I think, what they're looking at is not for specific organizations. They're prepared to support things like what we're doing here, or they've produced some guideline or guides for indigenous peoples. They've done some work for women. They've picked off some work, as I indicated, for African journalists. So they'll do things which are more generic. For particular groups of people. I think there's even a guide for trade unions as well in UNEP, I think. So that they've done those in more in that way. There has been in the past a number of national committees for UNEP mostly in developed countries, I think. And those have been platforms where they've played particular roles in capacity building organizations in those countries, but I'm not sure how active those are anymore.
Lada, one more for you.
Well, I think the one that is more appropriate for me, because it's a women's issue, It's about the question about the washable sanitary pads. I think that's something that I would see very, very appropriate for crowdfunding. It's something new, absolutely needed. And I think that is really into minds of people that they see as very important. So I think if it's about an investment or a kickoff grant or making promotion, I would really see that as possible within the crowdfunding. I'm now thinking of one of those crowdfunding, but maybe if you can send me an email, the one who wrote raised that question, I will find out the crowdfunding that I think would be helpful for you.
So my comment on crowdsourcing is, I think the success or failure of that crowdsourcing approach is on your database of people who you know, or that you can get access to, that have an interest in that issue. If you don't have an access to that, people won't go to the crowdsourcing site just without knowing you. So being able to be able to get it out to the right group. So there's a very good website called Comics Uniting Nations, not United, but Uniting Nations. And it has a whole lot of comics on the different SDGs, and they went out for crowdsourcing to get 50,000 or something, and they got 48,000, and then because they'd gone for the platform where you had to get the 50,000, they lost it all. So, but I was surprised they didn't get more, and they clearly hadn't got the right list servers to go to get to the right. I was watching a discussion on comics again today, and this particular comic had got 300,000, and that's because that particular person who was crowdsourcing to set up a particular comics, 12 comics or whatever on a particular issue, had gone to all the blogs that were on the blogs,
and human rights and the United Nations. So there'll be a lot of great information. So we're going to go quiet for 15 minutes. So stay with us and we'll be back in 15 minutes. Thank you very much. We'll see you soon.
Okay.
Hello and welcome back. We will soon resume. I will advance on to the next session. I'll wait for Felix and Lida to reinstate their microphones and their cameras. And our first session will be delivered by Felix Dodds. Looks like we still have everybody with us. Felix and Lida, welcome back. Felix, session 4 begins with multi-stakeholder partnerships, and you are up. Thank you.
That's great. If you take me to the next slide. Thank you very much. So just to kind of look at 3 different versions of what's going on. So in the world of partnerships, we mix up different terms as we do in other areas like civil society or stakeholders or NGOs. So multi-stakeholder partnerships, which is in a sense the major driving force for helping to deliver the SDGs. It's out of SDG 17, is where you have specific commitments and contributions undertaken by various partners together, intended to try and deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. That's the objective. It's a multi-stakeholder, and those stakeholders could include governments, because governments in this case would be a stakeholder. It could be an UN agency, could be the 9 major groups, or it could be broader than that and include community-based organizations or disabled people, people with disability. Voluntary initiatives came out of the Rio +20 process, and that was specific individual organizations making a contribution to delivering Rio +20 with their own commitments. So, for example, I think Microsoft made a commitment to reduce their use of energy. I can't remember what the actual commitment was, but we had over 700 commitments that were made by those individual organizations. It could be a government, could have been an NGO, could have been a women's group. Public-private partnerships, often there's a little bit of a mixture between, or a misunderstanding between that and MSPs, is a kind of contractual arrangement that happens between a single or several public agencies, federal, state, or local, and several or single private entities, though in certain cases you could find some NGOs involved with delivering some of the services that are required. There is a requirement in both multi-stakeholder partnerships and public-private partnerships for them to line up behind delivering the SDGs. And in fact, what happened last May is all the UN Regional Commission directors signed an agreement that they would develop a set of principles for PPPs for SDGs. Now, PPPs are problematic in many cases and in many countries, but there's an attempt to try and have a set of principles that for PPPs are aligned to help deliver the SDGs. The Economic Commission for Europe have already developed theirs. If you have an interest in that, you should find out from your regional UN Commission where they are in their consultation process on that. And it was one of the commitments that was made in the Addis Ababa action agenda that such a set of principles would be developed globally. But at the moment, that looks like to be more of a bottom-up approach, which might be a better way of doing it. If we could move on to the next slide. It's a little bit of the history. So the idea of multi-stakeholder partnerships became part of the outcome from the Johannesburg Summit on Sustainable Development held in 2002 in Johannesburg. And it was a process that grew from the stakeholders, which was that I guess if you go further back to the Rio conference in '92, the recognition that governments alone would not deliver the agreements out of the 92 conference, and that's why you had the 9 chapters on the different major groups, so that the recognition was that they needed to play a role in developing the policy, but also in then ultimately by Johannesburg, if they were helping to develop the policy commitments, then they should be involved in helping to deliver those policy commitments. And so it was known as Type 2 partnerships originally. And they were collaboration platforms between governments and NGOs and business and UN agencies. Stakeholder Forum organized an implementation conference in Johannesburg, and we launched 23 Type 2 partnerships. I'd say over 50% of them survived, which is actually quite a high group, but it included setting up a global network on rainwater harvesting was one of the partnerships that was set up, and then we had others that dealt with different issues. In the summit in 2012, that's where you saw the issue around voluntary initiatives happen, and as I said, 700 were produced, and there was a report by Stakeholder Forum done after I think 2 years with after the 2012 conference with the national NRDC to see whether those commitments had actually, those individual commitments had actually, voluntary commitments had actually happened. And I don't think Stakeholder Forum's followed up beyond that, but you know, it will be interesting to go back to see how many of those actually matured into action. If we could move on. Then the third conference that came into doing work around partnerships was the SIDS conference and in Samoa, and they had 6 thematical areas that they were working at, dialogues, and then underneath that, much more sensible, worked a number of partnerships to help deliver that. So they had 300 partnerships under those 6 areas. And what we haven't done enough about is clustering different partnerships around similar aims to enable those either targets or goals to be delivered in the SDG process. If we can move to the next slide. So there was a review done of how successful the 2002 partnerships were. And the Secretary General for the conference had said that we shouldn't try and group them together. We shouldn't try and, in a sense, set up a very strong or robust system of monitoring. The argument was 1,000 flowers bloom, and therefore some of them will succeed and some of them will fail. Well, 70% of them failed. So that wasn't a very good strategy. And there's a very good report on that by Beesham and Leash, which is worth reading. Most of the partnerships were not in developing countries, they were actually in OECD countries. So in fact, it wasn't helping to deliver sustainability to the poorest. It was actually dealing with it in northern countries. There was very little quantification of what was being delivered and very little funding to help that, partly because we were dealing with the aftermath of 9/11. And so the focus for money shifted from sustainable development towards peace and security. So that there was a reason why that didn't happen. If we could move to the next slide. All the partnerships for Rio, for Johannesburg in 2002, were guided by what became known as the Bali Guiding Principles, originally developed in 2002, and then became an official ECOSOC decision in 2003. And it kind of gave you a number of elements, you know, that these partnerships will be voluntary, that they'd be transparent, they'd have credible partnership members, they'd have some form of accountability, there will be a clear participation of all the participants, they will be multi-stakeholder, they would address it evenly around the geographical parts of the world, so it wouldn't just be in OECD countries, which it turned out more to be. And they would address the 3 pillars of sustainable development. There will be some form of capacity building and tech transfer. They will be an additional contribution to what was already being committed through ODA. So it was not to be a redirection of ODA funding, but should be an additional aspect of it. and that they should line up with national plans that already exist. So in many countries at that time, I think over 120 countries had national sustainability strategies, so they should line up with those to help them deliver. And that they should have, they're basically helping to deliver the agreements from Rio 92 and from Johannesburg, and then that would have predicted money and sustained resources. Well, a lot of that didn't happen. So if we could have the next slide. For the process that we're under now for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, there was no new intergovernmental decision on helping those partnerships to be much more focused and to be more to be able to quantify their contributions. And so the Secretariat had to try and develop something which was much more soft because they had no mandate to do more. And so they developed a smart criteria for partnerships, and governments seem to be okay about that. So specific, measurable, achievable, resource-based, time-based deliverables. So that's what the partnerships should do. And there was a hope that they would be able to be, in a sense, quantified. At the moment, we don't have that quantification of what their contribution is. There's, I don't know, 6,000, 7,000 partnerships on the UN website. There's no indication at the moment about what their contribution has been to help deliver sustainable development. And the 1,000 Flowers Bloom approach has actually been again advocated by developed countries. And so there was a push by developing countries to have a much more robust system, and they worked over 3 years on trying to change the system. But the developed countries did not want to have something which would, in a sense, be able to judge whether one partnership was actually working well and another one wasn't, or to even build a capacity building process to help those partnerships that were suffering because of a lack of money or a lack of ability to deal with stuff. So UNDES has tried to do as much as they can with no mandate to do more, and I think they can be commended for what they've done in the context of that. In UNEP, we don't have any of that, and I'll come to that in a minute. We could move to the next slide. Thought it'd be easier to look at 3 different success stories. So Gavi is a coalition of UN agencies, stakeholders. It also includes the vaccine companies. That coalition has brought everybody together who is going to try and work to address vaccines in the world. It's already had a huge success with over 300 million people getting vaccine by the end of 2020. That's the target that they're going for. They've already saved something like 13 million lives. So it's a success story. So there is a governance structure around Gavi, which engages all the different stakeholders. They've managed to support or improve the health services in something like 69 countries. So a very, very interesting example, which could be extrapolated around other SDGs. The polio eradication initiative has reduced polio by 99%. So again, a great success, again, a partnership which involved government stakeholders and the industry. And one of the partnerships that was launched at the Johannesburg summit, the REAP initiative, initially a target of trying to promote sustainable energy to be 5% of the total primary use by 2010. That was in fact exceeded by 2009. The International Energy Agency estimated they already had 13% of renewables, and it's already gone up to 19%. It may be more because that's a year out of date, that figure. So those are partnerships that have worked, and there's a lot of good examples of what the elements to make a good partnership are. And at the moment, we're not bringing those into something that actually informs the other partnerships. The final partnership I wanted to look at, if you could just move the next slide, is Every Woman, Every Child, which was a Secretary General initiative by Ban Ki-moon. And it involves 400 partners from a range of stakeholders, 70 governments, all trying to make specific commitments to advance women and children's health under this initiative. It has been reviewed, and there is a process for reviewing, external reviewing of this initiative. It's nice that that happens for this, and I guess it happens because it's a Secretary General initiative, but it hasn't happened for the partnerships that are listed in the UN database for delivering the SDGs. So again, there are some lessons about having some form of clustering of the partnerships, I think, around the different goals and targets so that they can work together and actually can support each other. If we could have the next slide. I've kind of looked, and I kind of think that the partnerships fall into three different areas. There's a sharing partnership, which is like the Global Water Partnership, where they're sharing information, capacity, and everything. And so they're not necessarily delivering the specific targets that are under the SDGs, but they're helping to build those through that knowledge platform. Then you have MSPs that are providing services. So Gavi is trying to do that. It's trying to deliver a specific target. And I think in the context of that, it's doing extremely well in doing it. And then you have ones which are setting standards. So like the CEO Alliance on Water Stewardship, but you could have looked at the Principles for Responsible Investment or the Banking Initiative, which we talked about yesterday. And so I think it would help to try and take the partnerships that are around for the for delivering the SDGs and try and break those down into those different types of partnerships, because then you could start to coalesce the ones that are actually going to deliver the target and they can be supported by those who are sharing knowledge, and they can be also supported by those who are delivering the standards, but they wouldn't be looked at in the same way. We would have a different type of review mechanism for those different ones. If we could move on to the next slide. So there's also been a whole lot of partnerships around companies' engagement. And so the Global Compact has over 10,000 companies that have signed up to the 10 principles in the Global Compact. So it's very important that companies are engaged and that those want to try and implement the SDGs in their own company reporting, and a number of them are doing that. There's now a template in the Global Compact website where you can enter your details and start to monitor your own delivery against the SDGs and their targets. But the question is, are those companies doing it? And so one of the very interesting things that the Secretary General's now putting his weight behind is the issue of benchmarking companies. Are they doing what they say that they're doing? And so the corporate benchmarking on human rights was the first benchmarking setup. And again, it was funded from the private sector. It was funded from the investment sector of the private sector, because again, they wanted to know whether these companies were actually doing what they were saying. So, you know, was it greenwash or was it real action? And so what you have there are a number of Global Compact companies against the corporate benchmarking on human rights. And so the first time they were reviewed in 2018, Pepsi were only delivering 22% against the Ruggie principles on human rights. Starbucks was doing 25%, Shell 37%, Coca-Cola 40%. If you had asked me before they had done this benchmarking, I would have expected Pepsi to be much, much higher, because they had been the first company to accept water as a basic human right, and that they would not go into communities where they were likely to have a negative impact on the water table. It turned out that wasn't true. When they did the second review of those companies, because their results were published and got to, particularly in the finance papers like the FT or the Economist, you saw in certain companies a massive in a sense, change over just even a year. So Pepsi moved from 22% to 51% against the Ruggie principles. Still not great, The companies at the top were people like Marks and Spencer's at about 70%, or in the extractive industries, Rio Tinto and BHP Billiton, which are again about 70%. Starbucks dropped back to 8.5%. So if you were thinking that you support human rights, you should definitely not be drinking any Starbucks coffee. If you should be asking them questions on why their human rights record is not better. Woolworths increased to 39%, Shell to 57%, Coca-Cola to nearly 60%, Gap to nearly 60%, and then Costco, which is a US wholesale shop, to 8.8. So the publishing of these benchmarkings is a way of moving those companies to start to deliver against what they're being asked to do. There's another group called the World Benchmarking Alliance, which are looking at benchmarking on gender, food and agriculture, climate through the Climate Disclosure Project, which is a partnership, seafood, and digital divide. So if you're interested in looking at which those kind of companies to see how they're doing against what they're meant to be doing, particularly in line with the SDGs or the Paris Agreement, these are the kinds of sites that you should go to. If we could move on to the next slide. So we're now going to go through a number of slides which actually go back to a report that UNEP had commissioned Stakeholder Forum to do in 2010. And we were asked to look at the stakeholder engagement in the program of work. This was Achim Steiner's first program of work, and whether there was any real engagement, a coherent engagement of stakeholders with UNEP. And what I would say is that when we re-looked at this, which was, I think, last year, pretty much none of the recommendations that we came out with had been enacted. But it is an alive conversation now, I think, and particularly because we're now going through a medium-term strategy and a new program of work. So what we did was we looked at the knowledge management system within UNEP. Was there a coherent center where the information of who UNEP was signing MOUs with to do specific work on different parts of the program of work, did that exist? It didn't. And so at the moment, I'm not aware that they've improved that, but one would hope that under the new ED that we could have a situation where there is a common knowledge base or knowledge platform which shows transparently who is working with UNEP on which parts of the program of work and what contributions that they have been able to make to deliver that. If we move to the next slide. So one of the things that we kind of mentioned yesterday was that, you know, the kind of stakeholders at the moment that are going to UNEP, by and large, particularly from the NGO sector, are those that are advocates. So they're there to influence the policy. It's a very important thing to do. What we're not getting are those that could be engaged in helping to deliver those policies once they've been agreed through the program of work. And so there is an opportunity for, with the new program of work, as again we mentioned yesterday, of trying to get stakeholders to help deliver that program of work, but also to help them to promote the results of that. If the stakeholders are engaged with helping to deliver part of the program of work, they'll should then be working with the communications division of UNEP in advocating for what they had achieved, because I think that that is really important. We can move to the next slide. So the strategic partnerships we believe needed to be addressed then, and we still believe that's true, is at the program and sub-program area. So once this medium-term strategy is set, program of work is adopted, under that there'll be a number of sub-programs to deliver that. All of those are areas by which you as a stakeholder group either should be lobbying to get specific sub-programs into the program of work, or should be looking to see if you could be one of the groups that can help deliver that, and therefore to help deliver UNEP's program of work. There is fragmentation at the moment within the UNEP approach to stakeholder engagement. In fact, when we were having a discussion with UNEP on who they were working with, it was clear that they didn't really understand the idea of stakeholders. They would work with IUCN or with WWF. They wouldn't think about, are there women's groups that we should be looking to work with? Are there indigenous peoples groups that we should be working with? Are there youth groups? And so there's a certain amount of internal education that I think needs to happen. If you could move to the next slide. So some of that is with UNEP taking a more strategic role in starting to map out who would be useful for them to work. So there's a level by which we can say we would like to be a partner with you on this, but there isn't really a responsibility of UNEP around any of the program of work once it's developed for the next MTS to be actually mapping out who are those stakeholders that we should be looking to work with. And at least if we're working on the basis of a stakeholder approach as opposed to a civil society approach, it means they have to ask, are there any women's groups we should be working with? Are there any youth groups? And the problem with doing it through a civil society lens is those questions aren't asked because there's not a requirement. They just look for a partner that calls themselves a civil society partner. So I think there's a really strong reason for advocating for a major group approach to this to the engagement on delivering the medium-term strategy. If you could move to the next slide. Thank you. So, I mean, literally, this is what I just said. And what we found when we looked through is there were very few indigenous peoples groups that were engaged with the program of work. There were very few youth groups that were engaged with the program of work. There were very few trade unions or farmers groups. So I think that the opportunity here is to try and get those, the opportunity to map out around the different program of work who they should be working with, because once you get a strong coalition of partnerships together, you're basically creating mini multi-stakeholder partnerships to help deliver the program of work. We could move to the next slide. So I think we're very close to the end. The process of major group and stakeholders as partners clearly needs to be one of the strategic objectives of UNEP. And I would argue at the moment that we're seeing a situation partly because there are no new rules for how UNEP or UNEA should engage with stakeholders, that we're not building up a strong enough team within UNEP to be able to do the kinds of work that we're doing. Now, we're not suggesting that the major group or civil society unit in UNEP would do all this, but it should be able to be staffed to enable it to be working with the other parts of UNEP to ensure that stakeholders are being engaged in helping to deliver the program of work. If we can move to the next one, which I think is a double. Next slide. It's the same one. Next slide. Yeah. So UNEP also adds value to the work that stakeholder groups can do. So if one was imagining that you've created a partnership with UNEP to help deliver the program of work, this offers you an opportunity also to be able to promote the work that you're doing with the support of UNEP, so that you would have the access to enable them to use their communications department to promote the ideas of what you're doing. What we'd like to see is a situation where there's much more of an opportunity for those partnerships to come together with UNEP prior to UNA 6, I would say, because we're too late for UNA 5, which can inform the policy conversation that UNA 6 would have. If we were able to have assigned partnerships between different stakeholder groups and UNEP in the period between now and UNEA 6 to help deliver the program of work, and then we're able to come to UNEA 6 and say, here are our experiences, I think that would make a better informed policy discussion for UNEP to have. If we could move to the next slide. And really, I think that's basically it. There's a need for establishing a number of guidelines to help stakeholders to engage in partnerships with UNEP. But these are the kinds of things that will be developed once the program of work is agreed. Okay, final slide. And Kamal Ashmal was the chair of the World Commission on Dams, but he was also the Minister of Water for South Africa. And he said a parting warning, doing conducting a multi-stakeholder process is never a neat, organized, tidy concerto. More often the process becomes a messy, loose-knit, exasperating, sprawling cacophony. Like pluralist democracy, it is the absolute worst form of consensus building or partnerships, except for all the others. And I think that's a very nice place to end for the discussion on partnerships.
Thank you, Felix. Lida, if you would please come in for the question and answer period. I'm just opening up and I'll remind the audience to please put your questions in the Q&A section rather than in the chat section. So let's begin with, let's see, how about, well, we have one question, how and what mechanism is there to, let's see, how and what mechanism to get in for Indigenous peoples? What are the mechanisms for Indigenous peoples to become involved?
Yeah, so at the moment they're engaged, I mean, Lida would know this better than me, that they're engaged, they have their own representatives on the major group steering committee, which you can go to through the UNEP Civil Society office. But I think if it's more about how can they engage in helping to deliver the program of work, that's going to be an issue once the medium-term strategy has been developed and agreed at UNEA 5, then you as a set of Indigenous organizations should look at that and see where you think there's an opportunity that you could add value and to try and work with UNEP on trying to engage Indigenous peoples in delivering that part of the medium-term strategy.
Lida, any comments on that?
Yeah, only on the mechanisms for having Indigenous people involved. Indeed, you have two co-facilitators for the major group of Indigenous people. They are mentioned on the website of UNEP. Yesterday, I think Aurora shared a link. Maybe we can do that again or send it later. But there you see all the names and emails of the facilitators that are in the major group facilitating committee. And they are, I mean, for your major group, Indigenous people, they are, let's say, responsible for disseminating all the information they have on UNEA and related stuff. So best contact one of those.
Thank you, Lida. I'd like to say I saw a couple of hands being raised in the chat section, but just to remind those if you've come in late that if you want, we're not able to invite you in to actually speak. So if you have a question, please enter it into the Q&A box and Felix and Lida will address it. At the moment, there are no further questions.
But there is the information that we have. We have one of the IPs for the major groups.
Yeah,
with
it just
us.
came in. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
Want to answer that?
There's not an answer for it.
Oh, I see. Oh, good. Okay, very good. Here we go. A question, can you share some of the crucial, I suppose, the criteria used to judge or assess companies on human rights performance? Because most of them seem to be doing great on human rights on face level.
I'm just going to find the page and send it to you. Wait a second.
Oh, you're going to share something? Okay.
Yeah. Wait a second. Right.
When you're ready, there's another question.
So I'm putting it in the chat box, and you can go and download the criteria, and you can download each individual company's score against the criteria.
Thank you, Felix. Another question, how can we develop a partnership with lead organizations and other stakeholder groups to strengthen the capacity building of the community in order to provide awareness among the masses?
Well, I mean, I think it depends what you're doing the capacity building for. If it's for delivering the SDGs or delivering a particular aspect of UNEA 5, plastics or something, then you bring together those organizations that have an interest in that, which you could do between, if you're doing it in your country, you could do between now and UNEA 5 and launch the partnership at UNEA 5. So you could work with the government, with the local government. You could identify those that you thought would be interested in doing it. There's a number of guides. So if you go to the UN, there's a high-level political forum partnerships site. There is a nice guide on how to put together partnerships there.
Thank you, Felix. Okay, I'm not seeing.
On the other question on how to get involved, my feeling and experience is that it's easier with your regional office. I mean, from the region, instead of directly with Nairobi. So as an NGO, it's easier and to find contact with the person in charge for civil society and partnerships in your regional office.
Thank you, Lida. I don't see any other questions, so why don't we move on to the next section, and Lida,
yeah. Okay, so the next session, I wanted to inform you a little bit on another process that is going on and which I think is quite important for environmental organizations to know. It's about the Global Pact for the Environment. I mean, it was the name as it was launched in 2017. It was a document that more than 100 environmental law expert judges, lawyers, etc., from over 40 countries, they wrote. It was an initiative full with principles on or having adopted a global pact for the environment. You can see it as a kind of parallel to the declaration for human rights, but also to have then a kind of declaration for environmental rights. Because as you know, the environment is still quite vulnerable. There are not really voices that are defending them. I mean, we have a lot of NGOs that are trying to protect it and defend it, but it doesn't have rights on its own. And in a lot of environmental law agreements, it's or not enforced or it is quite weak. Anyhow, it was a good friend of I mean, a personal friend of President Macron who took the lead in this initiative. So that's why it was, I think, easy for him to convince the French President Macron to present the idea of having a global pact for the environment at the UN General Assembly. And that happened in 2018. Next slide. The General Assembly accepts the idea, which I think was quite surprising because the initial text is quite progressive. So I don't know, maybe they were all on the toilet when they did, as Felix just mentioned as well, as one of the strategies to have something more progressive passed. Anyhow, they accepted the idea and adopted a resolution, which is 72277. And based on that, what's often happening with resolutions, they establish an ad hoc open-ended working group to find out what are the possibilities, the opportunities, etc., on really have that idea of having a global pact for the environment established and concretized. There were as often 2 co-chairs appointed. This time it was still a New York process. So those 2 persons also work on New York processes. So it had nothing to do with UNEP or UNEA. It was still something that happened within the General Assembly of the UN. It was Mrs. Amal Moudalalis from Lebanon and Francesca Duarte Lopez from Portugal. They co-chaired 4 meetings. One was in New York, but they found out quite quick that the ones that were, let's say, the experts on environmental issues were not based in New York, but in Nairobi. So we had the 3 other meetings we had in Nairobi. I was fortunate enough to be asked to lead the major groups in this whole process. So I went to those meetings as well as a facilitator of the major groups. It was a funny situation because we worked under the requirement and the conditions of ECOSOC. Even if we were sitting, well, the first time in New York, but the second time we were 3 meetings in Nairobi, where UNEP still had nothing to do with the whole process. So we were sitting in their rooms, in the conference rooms, etc. But they were in kind of visiting their own, this kind of this meeting, because it was still not a UNEP process. Also the major groups, the NGOs that were there, they had to be in ECOSOC accreditation, and within UNEP accreditation, you could not do anything. You could not enter the room. So it was a strange situation. Anyhow, it worked. After the 4 meetings, next slide, please. They delivered, and we all together, together with the major groups, because it was quite an open process, and documents to the General Assembly in 2019. That report was a report that identified and assessed also possible gaps in the international environmental law, because it was when we discussed the whole idea of having a global pact for the environment, of course, there were a lot of people that said, well, we already have a lot on environmental law. But we have the MEAs, we have a lot of other international environmental law, but the problem is that it's not really related to each other. It's quite parallel. We still have a lot of gaps. There's not always coherent language. And it is also not enforced. For lawyers or for judges in countries, when they have to say something about an environmental conflict, if they want to make their assessment on who is right and who is wrong, it's often difficult because several laws are saying something different, or it's not really defined on what the, let's say, the international law says about it. So that's why it is so important that a legal framework or more clarity is there on all the environmental law making. So in that report, it's a quite interesting report for ones, that are interested in this kind of legal stuff. And they assess the gaps as well. Also, there were several recommendations on how to strengthen the environmental governance there. We have a lot of MEAs. So one of the recommendations was that there would be more coordination between the MEAs, or having clusters on that, but that is always a little bit difficult to convince, because all the MEAs, they have their own secretariat, their own director, and they're not always willing to merge with other MEAs or even work together, because they're all sitting on their own little islands, how important it can be, but they're not always open to work together. So that's why we asked in that report to UNEP to take up a role, to take a lead in coordinating and facilitating the working together, the cooperation between the MEAs. There was, as I said, an active NGO participation. We also had 2 or 3 lawyers, let's say, that took the initiative for the Global Pact. And that was quite interesting. And a lot of member states that were, especially the one in the first meeting, but also in the second meeting, they were not really sending their legal experts to those meetings. So it was often a discussion about things that they were not really experts on. And as you can understand, if you talk about laws and regulation, etc., it's quite technical. So sometimes was quite difficult to have this kind of discussions. I think we from the major groups, we brought in the experts, so the legal experts, so that made it, I think, easier, and also for the member states interesting to know. As you can understand, as it was quite strong, there was a lot of reluctance from member states to kind of go with this idea, also because it was too pre-cooked, let's say. So it was an initiative, it was kind of already there, it was kind of take it or leave it. So for a lot of countries, they had a kind of no, we don't want that. It's not there. I mean, there was not an ownership created of this Global Pact for the Environment. Within Europe, it was also difficult because it was an initiative from France. And if it's an initiative from France, then Germany is against it, or at least reluctant to accept it, because yeah, you have this kind of political constellations as well. But I think anyhow, I mean, after many discussions, we kind of advanced there. But in the fourth meeting, in that expert meeting from the NGO side, we really thought, well, this is going to die. This initiative is going to die. It will not come up again on the agenda. So we were quite disappointed, but also a lot of member states were disappointed. What we did, what was the strategy of the major groups, was in kind of make it as a package. So not only have the principles there, because I mean, having principles is nice, having the Global Pact for the Environment, but it is also more important to enforce it as well. For a lot of southern countries, it was difficult because they say, well, that means that we have a lot of new law that we have to apply in our countries. We don't have the resources for enforcing it. We don't have the courts. We don't have the lawyers. We don't have the judges that are really into this kind of knowledge. So that's why we said, okay, it has to be a package. It is the principles, the Global Pact for the Environment, but it also has to have some funding for the countries that need resources for enforcing the law, etc. So that's, we also came up with the, I mean, that's the Montevideo program, to use also the Montevideo program there to fund for this as well. Anyhow, we thought that the process was that, but surprisingly, next slide, please. Next slide. Surprisingly, this General Assembly adopted again. I mean, they were agreeing on the reports. They endorsed all these recommendations, and they saw that a follow-up was necessary. I think the majority of the countries thought, well, a legally binding framework is quite difficult to get. Because that means a lot of negotiations, and that would be too slow. So they really went more into the, okay, we have already environmental law there. We need to strengthen it, and we need to have the instruments to implement it. So that's why, and they also thought that a lot of this kind of discussions is not the best place to discuss in New York, but they also kind of forwarded it's to UNEP to take a lead there as well. So they have they adopted the resolution, which is now called 73333. It's not called, even in the corridors anymore, the Global Pact. It's now the UN Assembly Resolution 73333. And that means that well, you can read it if you Google on it. But one of the things that now went to UNEP, and that will come back in UNEA 5 is the next slide. No, sorry, first this one. So then again, after the resolution, they appoint two co-chairs to follow up on the process. And this time it's two people that are known within the UNEP circles. So as the members of the Bureau of UNEA and the CPR, they appointed the two co-chairs. One is Mrs. Sakline Sairai from Pakistan, and Ado Lomus, you must know him, I think, from the UNEA 4, where he was quite visible as the personal assistant or director of the president of UNEA 4, the Minister of Environment from Estonia. So they already had a first meeting and a working group meeting. And next slide. And what is, I mean, their role? I mean, the role and the ambition of the working group that they are now co-chairing is, and that's you can find literally in the recommendation, is that they recommend. I mean, the General Assembly recommends the United Nations Environmental Assembly for its consideration to prepare at its 5th session, so UNEA 5, a political declaration for a United Nations high-level meeting, subject to voluntary funding, blah, blah, blah. And that has to be then presented in Stockholm plus 50 in 2022. That's the idea, to have a political declaration on this matter, on strengthening the implementation of the international environmental law and international environmental governance. So that's what we are now working on now. Well, they are working on together with the input from the NGOs. In the last working group, that was, I mean, that was a virtual one. I'm still facilitating, coordinating the input for the major groups. So it's not only the NGOs, but all major groups. It is, let's say, quite difficult to really have something bold. We don't want to have a kind of voluntary thing and say, oh yes, it's so important and blah, blah, blah. But we also really ask for an action plan and concrete recommendations on how to do that. We really think, I mean, when I say we, it's the group of major groups that were there, but a lot of member states are on our side. We really think that Stockholm plus 50 is the moment after 50 years of UNEP to deliver something that is really something to be proud of. So not a kind of, okay, yes, we still care about the environment, but it's also something that, okay, now after 50 years, we can kind of start with the idea to having environmental rights implemented and taken seriously by the legal frameworks. So that's, let's say, the ambition that we are now aiming for. I think something that comes back in UNEA 5. So something that I think is very important for you also to follow up. Next slide. The questions and answers.
Thank you, Ida. Felix, I see you're back. Let's see what we have in the way of questions. We could begin with one which is one of the most recent ones. Can you explain more about the ECOSOC process?
Yeah, when I said ECOSOC process, it means that if something is discussed in New York on sustainable development or environment, then it's under ECOSOC. But it was just to explain that the start of this global pact for the environment, and that's now come back to UNEP, started in New York, but came back to Nairobi, which is now a kind of UNEA process.
Thank you. There's a question going back to the funding matter earlier. And Felix, do you see, the two of you, turns out Felix is someone who's in North Carolina at the moment. We spent quite a bit of time on funding. I don't know if this participant came in a bit late. Do you want to just make a brief comment on that question? Do you see it?
I'm not looking at the questions, so.
Well, basically, this is someone stating the type of work they're doing with children and others and prisoners of conscience, and how can I apply for funding? It's a very general question.
I mean, I don't work in that particular area, so it'd be difficult to suggest. But I mean, I would assume that there are a reasonably large number of people from Vietnam and Cambodia living in the States. So I would look to try and raise money from that expatriate community that exists in the US. That will be a focus where I would go.
Thank you, Felix. Another question, is it possible and appropriate to engage religions in this effort? For instance, Hindus are observing 15 days of paying tributes to the departed souls. It finds shlokas and exhorts us to pray for all living beings, starting from the creator to the last living being. So how to get religious groups involved in these efforts?
They already are. There's a faith initiative that UNEP runs, which I'm putting a link to in the chat box.
Thank you, Felix.
On the questions of the open-ended working group on the Global Pact, no, it's all voluntary. I mean, the experts are the ones that, I mean, from the member states, I mean, they're paid by the government, of course, and the major groups, they are there also on their own account. Sometimes we find some funding for travels. That was last time. For the virtual meeting, we also had some very small grant to organize everything, but no, I mean, they're not paid for that.
There is a rate card somewhere on the internet for experts. It's based on, I mean, not for this specifically, but for other projects, but it's based on the level by which you are designated if you would be working for the UN. So they have a director level, and it goes D2, D1, P5, P4, P3. And so depending on your judged educational level or your competence in the issue, if they put out a tender for a particular piece of work, then it'll be for a particular level, and that will be then whatever they pay. UNEP not UNEP, but the UN doesn't pay particularly well for experts compared to governments who pay a lot more when they get experts. I think that the top rate is is something like $500 to $600 a day, which for an expert, if you're doing it for a government, would be a lot more.
Yeah, but when we talk about this kind of open-ended working groups of expert groups, I mean that then you're not paid experts. I mean then you're just part of the major group constituency.
You are, but for example, when we were doing the climate change negotiations, the Oasis took on Field as their legal experts, and they were paid as consultants.
Yeah.
Thank you both for that. One of the
Resolution 733.
Yeah, go ahead.
The UN document system. It's now, I think you have to still Google on Global Pact for the Environment, but I can send a link later when I'm again on the, and I can Google as well. But it's there.
Here we go. Another question, do you think UNEP needs to press more impactfully on governments to engage civil society organizations so that to have greater impact on grassroots level for environmental development?
I mean, UNEP doesn't operate at the grassroots level. It's not that type of body, so I'm not sure.
Well, the question is, should they press governments to engage more greatly at the grassroots level?
I mean, remember, UNEP is a civil service. So if they agree to a resolution which says that government should operate at that level, then yeah, all they can do is monitor if they have to report back. But there isn't a mandate to do that I'm aware of. Lida, can you think of one?
I think it's already mentioned in Agenda 21 how important civil society is on the national and on the local level for the implementation of sustainable development. So I think that's something you can always refer to. But of course, I mean the UN is an United Nations, so it's indeed the member states that are deciding on everything. So it's especially on this, I would just refer and ask your own governments. I mean, having all the references that are from Agenda 21, and so now telling that civil society is very important for the implementation for sustainable development.
Thank you. There's a question, I'll read it out and I'll actually try to answer it, but Felix, you might want to add to it. We have consultative status with ECOSOC, but not with UNEP. We have applied, but no response received. How do we engage in ongoing process at UNEP? One thing I would just make is that in our work, stakeholder forums work with UNEP at the moment, they're very behind on everything. So if you've formally applied, they're just, because they're dealing with the pandemic the way everybody else is. People are working from home. They don't have access to everything in their system. So if you've done the formal application process, it might just be that they're taking longer than usual. Felix or Lida, do you want to make any comment on that?
Just contact the civil society unit there on where they are with their application. But it's Alexander, Leticia, Aurora. I mean, the three. I would ask them. Normally they answer very quickly.
Yeah. Another question, who can we partner with at UNEA, UNEP with respect to policy related work, research, analysis? Are there any stakeholders in place that you would recommend to collaborate with respect to ocean policy development work?
So it depends on what you're dealing with on oceans, because I mean, you've got the unit which deals with land-based forms of pollution to the marine environment. If it's that, then there's a guy called Habib who runs that, and you can email me and I'll send you his email details.
You also have the blue economy strategy and reports. Says they are working quite a lot on marine issues.
Thank you both. There are no more questions in the Q&A box at the moment. So why don't we move on to the final section, and we'll come back to questions later. Lida, it's you have the honor of delivering the final session for today. Yes. I'll give the floor back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it is mostly about something that is coming up more and more is the recognition of the link between the human rights and the environmental rights and environmental issues. So I think it is important for environmental organizations. So I mean, all the organizations that are participating in UNEA also to have a look at opportunities they have there as well. There is indeed, as I said, a growing awareness that damaging the environment is also violating human rights. It's growing. There you see a lot more interest from lawyers, from organizations, and also within the research that something is lacking there. The human rights and the environment mandate that was created in 2012 says also that that one of the human rights is to have a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So that is very important and is recognized. Many states also have it already in their constitution. I don't say that they're all practicing it, but at least it's already in the constitution that they have to give you a healthy environment. Because of that growing interest and that growing awareness, there is now a memorandum of understanding between UNEP and the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. So that means that a work program is established about, let's say, defining and researching and recommend on the link between the environmental rights and human rights. Next one. No, yes, well. So it is also now that officially the human rights, the Office of the High Commissioner of the Human Rights recognizes that as well as a human right. So it's not a kind of something that is on paper, but it's really recognized, and that means that you can really work on it and refer to it in whatever you do on environmental issues. It is on climate and human rights. There is a paragraph in the resolution 723, which is from the Commission. the Commissioner of Human Rights. We have now, they also appointed a rapporteur of human rights and environment. The first one was John Knox. He really did amazing work in disseminating knowledge about those links. And David Boyd as well. He wrote interesting books on the rights of nature and etc. So it's really very, I would even say innovative and important to use this kind of language as well in all the discussions and negotiations we have with UNEP as well, because I think even within UNEP, we still see nature and animals, etc., as a kind of something that serves for us to grow our economy, etc., and to, let's say, to increase our well-being, without having really a good idea that nature has its rights as well, and animals also have their rights as well. So I think it's good to have this kind of new, I would say new, maybe it's very old. I think it's very, very old, but we kind of forgotten that nature and ecosystems and animals have rights as well. And how are we going to deal with that? How it is, I mean, also that we can protect it in this way as well. There are also new policies established, that's done in Nairobi by the Department of Law, policies to protect environmental defenders. As you know, a lot of environmental defenders are killed. It's still 7 or something per week. It's really a lot. And then not to talk about all the environmental defenders that are put behind bars in jail and are, I mean, prosecuted by governments or even also the companies. So that's a real big problem. And we don't have really policies to protect those environmental defenders or human rights defenders. So that's something that also now UNEP is working on a lot. Next one. So one of the mechanisms that we as NGOs can use to have environmental rights on the agenda of the Human Rights Commissioner is using the Universal Periodic Review, the UPR. It's a process that all countries are going through. It's every 3-4 years. There are cycles. You can look on the website of the Human Rights Council on when it's your turn of your country. So what you can do, and we did it for Holland. I recently did it for Paraguay. So I went to Paraguay to guide community-based organizations, local indigenous groups, women's groups, NGOs, to write a report on a kind of assessment on what's happening in the country related to environmental rights. And that report goes to I mean, that will be sent in October, and it will be on the agenda of the Human Rights Council next year. So then others have to review our report as well. I mean, the NGO reports as well. Next one. And when you have this report, it also means that that it has to be reviewed and talked about in the Human Rights Council as well. For us, integrating the violence of environmental rights is a kind of new. So all the issues that you would not directly see as a human right, although it is, of course, can be mentioned, like land grabbing, which is a huge problem in the south. Deforestation, of course, I don't need to explain you, is a huge problem, but also pollution, air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution. You can really say that this is violating your human rights. And also when you are in a country like I am in Belgium, where we have weak or very or even no policies on climate change or air pollution, healthcare, we can't complain about it in this country at least, or corporate accountability as well, because you have a lot of countries where corporates are kind of free to do what they want, so that you can also kind of see and frame as a violation of human rights. One of the first thing when, because I'm working together with some environmental lawyers, the first time we wrote a report as NGOs on environmental rights was in Holland. We received the compliments of, at that time, the Special Rapporteur for the Environment and Human Rights, John Knox, to kind of pave the way for other countries to do this as well, because it was for the first time that Holland was kind of punished by the Human Rights Council for not taking care of human rights in the country, and that was related to environmental rights. So that was something that was very new, and it even became in a lot of newspapers, because it was the first time that Holland was recommended by the Human Rights Council to take care of the human rights in the country. So it's a way of working for NGOs that I think is very interesting. It's very concrete, and I think it's even quite feasible to do also in your country. Next one is the questions and answers.
Thank you, Leida. Felix, if you'd like to come back. This is the final Q&A session. So I would, okay, let's see now if we have some questions. I'll start with the most recent one. The SDGs agenda is challenging and ambitious for most countries, but it's definitely the future we want. However, SDGs are an extreme challenge for fragile states. What is your opinion, what is your technical opinion about the partnerships and human rights efforts so far, SDG 12? And if you see transboundary positive or negative effects, where do you see the most issues for fragile states? If you might want to look at the more detail yourselves before you answer.
I think that's an extremely difficult question, of course. I mean, it depends a lot on which stage you are. I think I would start with approaching your own government, and even also on I mean, national bodies there are. But I think it's the same answer maybe as always, is to try to join forces as civil society organizations to lobby on your government, etc., and then go higher up in the process, which is to the UN. I think the SDGs are really a good framework and hook to work with. I mean, it's linking all the problems together. So I think it's really important to have that framework in mind when you work together with other civil society organizations in your country.
I think UNDP do a certain amount of work on fragile states, so that might also be a place to go to look.
Thank you. Leida, there's a question. Could you repeat when the next deadline is to submit reports for the Universal Period Review?
Yeah. Well, it depends on your country. I mean, for Belgium, Paraguay, it's I mean, the deadline is the 15th of October, and then it will be handled in somewhere in 21, I think in May, but I mean, they keep changing dates because of the corona. Yeah, you have to look on their website. I mean, if you can tell me your country, then I can look it up for you. I can send it later. But it's I mean, it's because we have a lot of countries, of course, and the process is quite intensive. So it is so they don't do all the countries in the same year. So it's more or less every 3-4 years that it's that your country is on the agenda.
Thank you, Leida. Another challenging question. How do we balance between nature and human rights? Where do we draw the line?
Yeah, that is indeed, of course, a very challenging question. But I mean, humans are nature as well. So it is indeed even a philosophical question. I would really, I mean, if you're interested in that, I would really recommend to read the books. The last one of David Boyd is really interesting. And even for me, I mean, working in this issue, it was an eye opener on many things. It's quite easy to read. And what is good, I think, this kind of books, I mean, he's not the only one that is writing on environmental rights, of course. It's also inspiring for a lot of processes that are going on now. It's in the one health, one planet, in the whole discussion on COVID, because it's clear that the whole COVID thing is also because of the exploitation, the too much pressure on nature, etc. So I think that people are getting aware of the fact that we cannot just treat nature or ecosystems as we are doing now. So yeah, I mean, we have rights as humans, but I mean, I would say it stops where you really are threatening the rights of other people and nature and ecosystems, etc. Also, ecosystems are our future. I mean, it's not something that we can use for free. I mean, it's even for our own good to kind of save it.
Another challenging question, good questions. According to the UNEP policy on protecting environmental offenders, what if a state member is opposed to it? Could you please clarify if there are any defined ways to implement these kind of policies? So I guess another way.
There is, and I don't know if it's already functioning, but at least the last time I saw it was still not functioning. It was still a draft. So there is an email where you can send your griefs to. I mean, it's kind of anonymous without that your government knows, because I know that a lot of environmental defenders have to work in secrets. I mean, I was once director of ANPET, so we had a lot of NGOs in Central Asia, where it is also kind of very risky to work on environmental issues. So it is not only in South America, it's also part of Europe has the same problems. But then you can kind of anonymous ask for help and support for your case. And that's one of the things that is now, well, I mean, in progress, I would say, but it goes quite rapidly. So I can give you more insights if you mail me, because I don't have it all at hand here, but it is always a problem, of course, if your country is, I mean, we see not just now in Belarus, where one of my former colleagues was taken, I mean, an environmental activist was taken into prison. We are now having all kinds of campaigns to have her released from prison. So it happens, I mean, every day. And that are the cases that we know. There are a lot of people that we don't even know that they are disappeared or whatever. So it's really in daily experience. And that's why I think it's very important that we work on that.
There's a question specifically about pesticides and carcinogens. Could the use of pesticides of known carcinogenic properties yet promoted locally and nationally be considered an infraction of human rights?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that we detected in Paraguay, where a lot of people, I mean, entire communities are fumigated by pesticides, causing cancer and miscarriages, how you say that in English. It's terrible. I mean, and yes, indeed, that's absolutely in violation of human rights. And that's what I think why it is so important that this kind of things are also part of the agenda of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, and not only kind of discussed in Nairobi, but really seeing this as because the human rights is more a kind of legally binding thing. So it's something that it's much stronger than claiming your rights somewhere else. I think it's good that it's on the agenda of the human rights as well.
Another question, statement and a question. Integrating environmental rights to human rights is still a challenging matter. Is there any chance that UNEP can influence UN state members to work together with CSOs and shrink limited lines between these two categories?
Absolutely. I mean, and they want to do that. I mean, that's why there is that memorandum of understanding as well. They do see that it's something that is urgent, but as always at the UN, everything's quite slow. But yes, I mean, they are working on it together with the memorandum of understanding. But well, it's also up to us and many other NGOs to keep stressing the priority of it.
Thank you, Letta.
And really recognize that there exist environmental crimes. I mean, it's not only about environmental damage or something, it's really an environmental crime. And that's something that we really need to have that recognized. I mean, yesterday we had a report of the Living Planet. I mean, where you see that 70% of animals are just disappeared since 1970 until 2016, which I think is, I mean, it's a nightmare, I think. And that's why I think we need stronger measures to stop this. For me, it's ecocide, but that's also not a concept that is still accepted by everybody.
Thank you, Ada. There are a number of statements rather than questions. Here we go. Another question. Again, more statements than questions. So no real specific question at the moment. There are a couple of questions that I'm going to answer. I'll answer one verbally and I'll send it to, someone is asking, after reviewing links and presentation, there will be more questions. Will we be able to contribute to this process with stakeholder forum? I'll put an email address in that answer, but it's just to send emails to webinars@stakeholderforum.org, and we'll certainly respond to you. Let me see if there are any more questions at the bottom. Yeah, a few more have come in. Here we go. Oops. I was like, somebody, maybe one of you is answering one. It just disappeared. That was you, Ida. Okay, good.
I think so.
Yeah. The questions have sort of slowed down. We're a bit ahead of schedule, but we are now due. That's the end of the presentations. What I think we can do now is ask Lyda and Felix maybe to make a few final comments before I wrap up the session. Who would like to go first? Lyda, you're welcome to take the floor.
So I think, well, those the sessions that we handled today was a mix of working on advocacy, understanding the papers that come out, documents of the UN with I mean all the, let's say, the UN language that you need to understand. So it's really about advocacy. I think we also talked a lot, and I think that's important as well, on how to really work together with the UN on the implementation. Which can be done several ways. I think the funding is one, but often that goes together as well. What I think is also important that we learned today is that UNEA is very important, but you also have related processes. And I think it's also important to have at least knowledge of that one. I mean, I raised only the Global Pact and human rights, but you also have processes within the CBD, within the FAO, which are maybe also quite related to the topics you are working on. So I think it's very good to have a kind of overall understanding of the UN and see where your projects or your topics you're working on fits in. So it's not only waiting every 2 years to go to UNEA and be part of that, but also see where United Nations and your governments, where they can be helpful or where you have to stop them. I mean, it's also, I mean, especially also on governments, sometimes they have policy that you just have to stop or improve. I mean, in Paraguay, I mean, there was a lot of law that was quite okay, but it was just not enforced. I mean, it was not implemented. So yeah, I think it's and yeah, what is important now that now you have knowledge, or you can read it back or hear it back in the recordings and in the documents, is that you start to disseminate this kind of information to your constituencies. I mean, to others. So this is a training for trainers. Capacity building. So it is important that this knowledge doesn't stay at your desk, but it's also being broader, because we can't do capacity buildings in every country. So it's now up to you to use this information and disseminate it to others. Thank you. And thank you for being here.
Thank you, Lyda. Felix, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, I mean, just to underline what Lida said, you know, the resources that we've created are for you to use in your country, and we'd love to have feedback on any workshops that you do, to share the information that you've learned. And, you know, clearly we'd like you to fill in the questionnaire when we finish today to give us information on what you thought was useful, so that we can home it down for the next couple of workshops that we're doing on this. I would also say that 2021, assuming that we have a vaccine, is going to be a very full year. And so depending on what your issue is, you're going to be looking at a series of very important meetings, which you could be looking at building a narrative on particular issues all the way through that. So for example, IUCN at the moment have their World Congress in January. You've got in February UNEA 5. You've got the World Water Forum in Senegal, the 9th World Water Forum in at the end of March. You've got UNCTAD 15 in April in Barbados. You've got the Finance for Development Forum in April in New York. You've got the Convention of Biological Diversity in May in China. You've got the first preparatory meeting for Glasgow in May and June for climate change. You've got the UN Food Systems Summit in July. You've got the High Level Political Forum in July. You've got the Rotterdam All Chemical Conventions meeting in July, that cluster. You've got the September will be the General Assembly. And then you'll have the UN World Data Forum in October, the Mercury Convention meeting also in October, and then in November you've got UNFCCC. So it's an extremely full year as far as sustainable development meetings, and again in August you've got the World Water Week in Stockholm. So there may be a kind of set of meetings that you can work through depending on your issue, where you can try and advance something quicker than you would normally. And if the United States election goes a particular way, hopefully there'll be a more sympathetic person in the White House as far as advocating sustainable development is concerned. I hope you found these 2 days useful, and I hope that when we meet at UNEA 5, you can start to practice some of the things that that we've tried to share with you. Thank you.
Felix, thank you very much for those closing comments. It's now time for us to conclude this second of 2 days of training. Many thanks to all of you for joining us today, and to the civil society unit at the United Nations Environment Program for their cooperation and contributions. Also, a huge thanks to Felix and Lida for delivering the rich content today and yesterday. As this is the last of the 2 training webinars, please note that those who participated on both days will be entitled to a continuing education certificate, which we will issue in the days following completion of the webinars. As mentioned earlier, this webinar has been recorded and it's been live streamed on YouTube. We will place a link on the Stakeholder Forum website to the YouTube recording, as well as a copy of the presentations. And as we promised today, we'll put the documents up so you'll be able to do the homework assignment if you wish. That'll happen within the next 24 to 48 hours. Finally, a short survey will pop up when the webinar ends. Please take a few moments to complete it. The survey helps us improve these webinars and also have a better idea of what we can do for you in capacity building in the future. Thank you. Best wishes to all, and please stay safe. Thank you. Bye-bye.